projection of the ego on the thought image which the man has created. It follows also from the conditions of man in devotion that he can no longer be recalled to earth by spiritualistic methods. In spite of men in devotion being not readily accessible to influence from without, nevertheless one who can pass into the mental world in full consciousness can affect those in devotion to some extent. Thus he could flood them with thoughts of affection, for example, and although these thoughts may not be able so far to penetrate the shells as to make those within the shells conscious of the author of the thoughts, yet the stream of affection can act on the occupants of the shells much as the warmth of the sun can operate upon the germ within the egg, hastening its fructification and intensifying any pleasurable sensations it may be supposed to have. If a man is an agnostic or a materialist, his disbelief in a future life does not in the least prevent him from experiencing astral or mental life just the same as anyone else, for a man's disbelief in a future existence clearly cannot alter facts in nature. If a man has lived an unselfish life, the forces which he has generated must work themselves out, and this can take place only on the mental plane in devotion. There is, of course, no fatigue in devotion. It is only the physical body that ever becomes tired. When we speak of mental fatigue, it is the brain and not the mind that is tired. The fact that our minds can grasp 3 dimensions only, whereas there are 4 dimensions on the astral plane, and 5 on the mental plane, makes it difficult to describe exactly the position in space of those who have left physical life. Some tend to hover round their earthly homes, in order to keep in touch with their friends of the physical life and the places which they know. Others, on the other hand, have a tendency to float away and to find for themselves, as if by specific gravity, a level much further removed from the surface of the earth. Thus, for example, the average person passing into heaven life tends to float to a considerable distance above the surface of the earth, although on the other hand, some of such people are drawn to our level. Still, broadly speaking, the inhabitants of the heaven world may be thought of as living in a sphere or zone round the earth. For all but very highly advanced persons, the heaven life is absolutely necessary, because it is only under its conditions that aspirations can be developed into faculty and experiences into wisdom. The progress which is thus made by the soul is far greater than would be possible if by some miracle the man was enabled to remain in physical incarnation for the entire period. But for the advanced man who is making rapid progress, it is sometimes possible to give up the life of bliss in the heaven world, to renounce devotion, as it is sometimes called, between 2 incarnations, in order to return more rapidly to carry on work on the physical plane. But no man is permitted to renounce blindly that of which he is ignorant, nor to depart from the ordinary course of evolution unless and until it is certain that such a departure will be for his ultimate benefit. The general rule is that no one may renounce devotion until he has experienced it during earth life, until he is sufficiently developed to be able to raise his consciousness to that plane and bring back with him a clear and full memory of its glory. The reason for this is that it is the life of the personality, with all its familiar personal surroundings, which is carried on in the lower heaven worlds, and therefore, before the renunciation can take place, the personality must realize clearly what it is that is being given up. The lower mind must be in accord with the higher on this subject. To this general rule there is an apparent exception. In the one-sided and artificial condition which we call modern civilization, people do not always develop quite regularly and normally. Cases are to be found in which a considerable amount of consciousness on the mental plane has been acquired and duly linked on to the astral life, yet no knowledge of it ever gets through into the physical brain at all. Such cases are very rare, though they undoubtedly exist. They are not, however, exceptions to the principle embodied in the general rule that the personality must make the renunciation. For in these cases, the astral life would be one of full and perfect consciousness. For the personality, even though no memory of it ever penetrated into the purely physical consciousness. Thus, the renunciation is made by the personality, but through the astral consciousness instead of through the physical, as in most instances. Such cases would be unlikely to occur except among those who were at least probationary pupils of a master. A man who wishes to perform the great feat of renouncing devotion must work with intense earnestness to make himself a worthy instrument in the hands of those who help the world, and must throw himself with devoted fervor into labor for the spiritual good of others. A man sufficiently advanced to be permitted to renounce his devotion would clearly have enjoyed an extremely long heaven life. He is then able to expend this reserve of force in quite another direction, for the benefit of humanity, thus taking a part, however small, in the work of the Nirmanakas. When a pupil has decided to do this, he waits upon the astral plane until a suitable incarnation can be arranged for him by his master. Before the attempt can be made, permission of a very high authority must be obtained. Even when this is granted, so strong is the force of natural law, that it is said the pupil must be careful to confine himself to the astral plane, lest if once, even for a moment, he touched the devachanic plane, he might be swept as by an irresistible current into the line of normal evolution again. In some cases, though these are rare, the man is enabled to take an adult body whose previous tenant has no further use for it, but naturally it is not often that a suitable body is available. An animal that has attained individualization, after his death on the physical and astral planes, has usually a very prolonged, though often somewhat dreamy life in the lower heaven world. His condition is sometimes called dozing consciousness, and is analogous to that of a man on the same level, though with far less mental activity. He is surrounded by his own thought images, even though he may be but dreamily conscious of them, and these will of course include images of his earth friends in their very best and most sympathetic moods. These images will of course awaken response from the egos of his friends in the usual way. The animal will remain in the condition described until in some future world he assumes the human form. Individualization, by means of which an animal rises to the human kingdom, is attained by association with men, the intelligence and affection of the animal being developed to the degree necessary by his close relationship with his human friend. But we have already dealt with this matter in Chapter 13. Chapter 23. Detailed experiences in the lower mental subplanes. Although each of the four lower heavens possesses its own characteristics, it should not be assumed that a person divides their heaven life among the various levels according to developed qualities. On the contrary, a person awakens to consciousness in devotion on the level that best corresponds to their degree of development, and remains on that level for the entirety of their life in the mental body. This is because a higher level encompasses the qualities of the lower levels as well as its own unique attributes, and its inhabitants almost invariably possess these qualities in fuller measure than those on lower levels. The lowest heaven, situated on the seventh subplane, is principally characterized by affection for family and friends. This affection must be unselfish but is usually somewhat narrow. Love is not confined to this level. Rather, it represents the highest form of affection of which those on the seventh subplane are capable. Higher levels exhibit love of a far nobler and broader type. Typical examples of inhabitants on the seventh subplane include a small tradesman, honest and respectable but lacking intellectual or religious development. Although he may have attended church, religion was a dim concept to him, disconnected from daily life, yet he maintained warm and constant affection for his family, working more for their benefit than his own. His surroundings in devotion would be simple, yet he would experience the fullest happiness possible for him and develop unselfish qualities that would become permanent. Other examples include a father whose young daughter remained with him in devotion, inspiring visions of her future, a young girl absorbed in her father's perfections and planning surprises for him, and a Greek mother delighting in her 3 children, imagining her son as a victor in the Olympic Games. In recent centuries, this subplane has seen many Romans, Carthaginians, and Englishmen, as unselfish activity in these nations often expresses itself through family affection. Comparatively few Hindus or Buddhists occupy this level, as their religious devotion typically influences daily life more directly, guiding them to higher planes. Observed cases display almost infinite variety, with degrees of advancement indicated by luminosity and developed qualities reflected in color differences. Some were lovers consumed by devotion to a single beloved, while others were nearly savage but exhibited traces of unselfish action. In all cases, the only aspect of personal life expressed on the mental plane was affection. Thought images at this level are often imperfect, limiting the ability of egos to express themselves fully. Yet even in such cases, the expression surpasses what was possible in physical life. For those on the lowest level of the heaven world, there is little material for the development of faculties, and life is only slightly progressive. Family affections are nurtured and slightly expanded, and rebirth occurs with an improved emotional nature and a greater capacity to recognize and respond to higher levels. Chapter 24. Nature of Phenomena in the Mental World. The dominant characteristic of the 6th subplane of the heaven world may be described as anthropomorphic religious devotion. There is some correspondence between this level and the 2nd astral subplane, the difference being that on the astral plane religious devotion invariably contains an element of selfishness or bargaining, whereas in the heaven world the devotion is entirely free from such taint. This phase of devotion, consisting essentially of the perpetual adoration of a personal deity, is to be distinguished from higher forms expressed in performing definite work for the deity's sake. Examples illustrate these distinctions. A considerable number of entities on this level are drawn from Oriental religions, including only those whose devotion is pure but comparatively unreasoning and unintelligent. Worshippers of Vishnu and a few of Shiva are present, each absorbed in their own thoughts, alone with their deity, and largely oblivious of the rest of humanity except insofar as their affections link those they loved on earth to their worship. A Vaishnavite was observed entirely absorbed in ecstatic worship of the image of Vishnu to which he had made offerings in life. Women constitute a large majority of the inhabitants, exemplifying this subplane. Among them was a Hindu woman who had glorified her husband into a divine being and imagined the child Krishna playing with her own children, though while her children were fully real, the child Krishna was evidently only the semblance of a blue wooden image animated in her mind. Krishna also appeared as an effeminate young man playing a flute, yet she was not confused by this dual manifestation. Another woman, a devotee of Shiva, regarded her husband as a manifestation of her god, so that one seemed to transform continually into the other. Some Buddhists also appear here, usually less instructed individuals who revere the Buddha as an object of adoration rather than a teacher. Many Christians are found at this level, such as an illiterate Roman Catholic peasant full of unreflective devotion, or a sincere soldier of the Salvation Army. An Irish peasant was observed absorbed in profound adoration of the Virgin Mary, whom he visualized as standing on the moon, extending her hands and speaking to him. A medieval monk contemplated Christ crucified with such intensity of love and pity that, as he observed the blood flowing from Christ's wounds, the stigmata manifested on his own mental body. Another man focused on a glorified Christ on a throne, with a crystal sea before him and a vast multitude of worshippers, among whom he stood with his family. Despite deep affection for his relatives, his thoughts centered on adoration of Christ, whose form he imagined kaleidoscopically alternating between a man and a lamb bearing the flag as depicted in church windows. A Spanish nun who had died at about 19 imagined herself accompanying Christ during his gospel life and tending the Virgin Mary after the crucifixion. Her depictions of Palestine were entirely inaccurate, the Savior and disciples dressed as Spanish peasants, hills near Jerusalem clothed with vineyards, and olive trees hung with gray Spanish moss. She envisioned herself martyred and ascending into heaven only to relive repeatedly the life she cherished. A child who died at 7 was occupied in reenacting religious stories told by his Irish nurse. He loved to think of himself as playing with the infant Jesus, and helping him to make those clay sparrows which the power of the Christ is fabled to have brought to life and caused to fly. Even if a man is a materialist and agnostic, he will still have a heaven world, provided he had been capable of devotion. For deep unselfish family affection, as well as earnest philanthropic effort, are also great outpourings of energy, which must produce their result, and can produce it nowhere but on the mental plane. It will be seen that blind, unreasoning devotion, of which examples have been given, does not at any time raise its votaries to any great spiritual heights, but of course they are entirely happy and fully satisfied, for they receive the highest which they are capable of appreciating. Nor is such a heaven life without a very good effect on their future career. For although no amount of mere devotion will ever develop intellect, yet it does produce an increased capacity for a higher form of devotion, and in most cases it leads also to purity of life. A person, therefore, who enjoys a heaven such as has been described, is not likely to make rapid progress. Yet he is at least guarded from many dangers, for it is improbable that in his next birth he will fall into any of the grosser sins, or be drawn away from his devotional aspirations into a merely worldly life of avarice, ambition, or dissipation. Nevertheless, a survey of the 6th subplane distinctly emphasizes the desirability of following the advice of St. Peter. Add to your faith virtue and to virtue knowledge. Chapter 25. Key features of mental thought centers. The chief characteristic of this level of the heaven world may be described as devotion manifested in active work. It is particularly the plane for the execution of great schemes and designs unrealized on earth, of large organizations inspired by religious devotion, often with philanthropic objectives. It must be noted, however, that as we ascend, greater complexity and variety are introduced, resulting in many variations and exceptions that do not immediately conform to the general character of the plane. A typical case, somewhat above average, involved a deeply religious man carrying out a grand scheme he had devised for improving the condition of the poorer classes, including business amalgamation to achieve economies, high wages, provision of cottages and gardens, and profit sharing. He hoped this demonstration of practical Christianity would attract many to his faith out of gratitude for the material benefits they received. A comparable case was that of an Indian prince who sought to model his life and governance on the divine hero King Rama. While many of his schemes had failed on earth, in his heaven life everything succeeded, with Rama personally advising, directing the work, and receiving perpetual adoration from devoted subjects. A notable example of personal religious work was a nun of a working order who, in heaven, continuously fed the hungry, healed the sick, clothed and assisted the poor, each recipient immediately assuming the appearance of Christ, whom she then worshipped with fervent devotion. An instructive case involved two intensely religious sisters, one a cripple, the other devoted to caring for her. On earth they had planned religious and philanthropic work together, and in heaven each became the prominent figure in the other's heaven, the cripple restored to full health, with both imagining the other actively fulfilling the unrealized aims of their earthly lives. In these instances, death had merely removed disease and suffering, rendering possible what had previously been impossible. This plane also hosts highly devoted missionaries, engaged in the congenial task of converting multitudes to their religion. Some devotees of art are found here, pursuing art for its own sake or as an offering to their deity, without concern for its effect on others. Artists motivated by fame or self-gratification would not reach this plane. Those who regarded their talent as a sacred power for the spiritual elevation of others would ascend to an even higher heaven. For example, a musician of deeply religious temperament treated all his creative work as an offering to Christ, unaware of the magnificent display of sound and color his compositions produced on the mental plane. His enthusiasm was not wasted, for it brought joy and assistance to many, enhancing his devotion and musical capacity in his next life. Without the broader aspiration to benefit humanity, this type of heaven life might continue almost indefinitely. The three lower heavens on the seventh, sixth, and fifth subplanes are primarily concerned with devotion to personalities, whether family and friends or a personal deity, rather than the wider devotion to humanity itself, which finds expression on the next subplane. Chapter 26. Accessing Nature's Memory in the Akashic Records. The fourth heaven, situated on the fourth subplane, occupies the highest position within the lower Rupa levels. Its activities are so diverse that it is challenging to classify them under a single defining feature. They are most suitably organized into four principal categories: selfless pursuit of spiritual knowledge, advanced philosophical or scientific thought, literary or artistic talent applied selflessly, service rendered purely for the sake of service. Examples of each category help to clarify their nature. Selfless pursuit of spiritual knowledge. The majority of individuals in this category come from religions that emphasize the necessity of acquiring spiritual knowledge. Among Buddhists, this includes those intelligent followers who regarded the Buddha as a teacher rather than an object of worship, whose highest aim was to learn at his feet. In their heavenly existence, this desire is realized, for the mental representation they hold of the Buddha is not a hollow image, but one through which the profound wisdom, power, and love of this preeminent earthly teacher shines. They continue to acquire new understanding and broader perspectives, which profoundly influence their subsequent incarnations. They may not recall specific details, yet when such details appear in later lives, they recognize them intuitively as true. Moreover, the teachings foster in the ego a strong inclination toward broader and more philosophical comprehension of such matters. This form of heavenly existence significantly accelerates the evolution of the ego, demonstrating the great benefit of following the guidance of living and capable teachers. A comparable, though lesser, effect occurs for individuals who embrace the works of a great spiritual writer and idealize that figure. The writer's ego participates in the student's heavenly experience, bringing the written teachings to life and further illuminating their meaning through the writer's developed powers. Many Hindus reach this level, as do some advanced Sufis and Parsis, along with certain early Gnostics. However, with the exception of a few Sufis and Gnostics, neither Islam nor Christianity generally elevate followers to this level, although some adherents may attain it due to personal qualities unrelated to their religious doctrines. This level also includes diligent students of occultism not yet prepared to renounce their devotion, encompassing those studying systems of occult knowledge beyond those commonly known to members of the Theosophical Society. A notable case involved an individual who had adopted an unjustified and unworthy mistrust of a former friend and teacher, thereby partially closing herself to the higher influence and instruction she could have received in her heavenly existence. The guidance was available, yet her mental disposition rendered her somewhat unreceptive, although she remained unaware of this. An abundance of love, strength, and knowledge was within reach, but her ingratitude had significantly limited her capacity to embrace it. Advanced philosophical or scientific thought. This category excludes philosophers engaged in verbal disputes and minute distinctions, for such discussions stem from selfishness and vanity and cannot lead to genuine understanding of universal truths, nor produce results effective on the mental plane. It encompasses rather the noble and selfless thinkers who seek knowledge solely to illuminate and assist others. A representative case is a later adherent of the Neoplatonic system, devoted to unraveling its complexities and understanding its relevance to human life and development. Another case was that of an astronomer whose studies had led him to pantheism. He was still pursuing his studies with reverence, and was gaining knowledge from those orders of Devis, through whom on this plane the majestic cyclic movement of the stellar influences seems to express itself in ever-changing coruscations of living light. He was lost in contemplation of a vast panorama of whirling nebulae and gradually forming systems and worlds, and striving to form some idea of the shape of the universe. His thoughts surrounded him, shaped as stars, and he listened with joy to the stately rhythm of the music that pealed out in mighty chorales from the moving orbs. Scientists such as this astronomer would return to Earth as great discoverers, with unerring intuitions of the mysterious ways of nature. Literary or artistic effort exercised unselfishly. On this level are found our greatest musicians. Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, Wagner, and others are still flooding the heaven world with harmony far more glorious than they were able to produce when on earth. Streams of divine music pour into them from the higher regions, to be specialized by them and made their own, and then to be sent forth through all the plane in a tide of melody which adds to the bliss of all around. Both those who are functioning in full consciousness on this plane and disembodied entities of this level, each of whom is wrapped up in his own thought cloud, are deeply affected by the ennobling influence of this music. Painters and sculptors are here constantly making, by their thought, artificial elementals in all kinds of lovely forms, which they send forth for the delight and encouragement of their fellow men. These beautiful conceptions may also in many cases be grasped by the minds of artists still in the flesh, acting as inspirations to them. An interesting figure seen on this level was that of a chorister who had died young. He had little save the one great gift of song, but he had used that gift worthily, trying to be the voice of the people to heaven, and of heaven to the people, and ever longing to know more music, and render it more worthily, for the Church's sake. In his heaven life his wish was bearing fruit, and over him was bending the quaint angular figure of Saint Cecilia, formed by his thought of the picture of her in a stained glass window. This thought form was vivified by one of the archangels of the celestial hierarchy of song, and through it he taught the chorister a grander strain of music than ever earth has known. Another example was that of a man who had on earth refused to use his literary power merely to earn a living for himself, but had instead written a book which none would read. He had been alone all his life and eventually died of sorrow and starvation. In his heaven life he was also in solitude, but he saw stretching before him the utopia of which he had dreamed, and the vast impersonal multitudes whom he had longed to serve. The joy of their joy surged back to him and made his solitude a heaven. Service for the sake of service. On this level are found many who have rendered service for the sake of service, rather than because they desired to please any particular deity. They are engaged in working out with full knowledge and calm wisdom vast schemes of beneficence, magnificent plans of world improvement, and at the same time they are maturing powers with which to carry them out in the future on the lower plane of physical life. Chapter 27. Diverse beings inhabiting the mental plane. It is the function of mental matter to vibrate in response to the modes of the spirit operating as intellect, just as astral matter responds to desire and emotion, and Buddhic matter reacts to the spirit functioning as intuition. Therefore, the mental plane represents the aspect of nature associated with consciousness as thought, not with the mind operating through the physical brain, but with the mind functioning in its own realm unburdened by physical matter. The 5 lower planes of nature correspond to the 5 elements of the ancients. Certain Hindu texts provide an alternative classification, grouping the mind with the elements. The Hindu perspective often considers existence from a high vantage point, sometimes that of the monad, viewing the mind merely as an instrument of consciousness. In the 7th chapter of the Gita, Sri Krishna states earth, water, fire, air, ether, manas, buddhi, and ahamkara as the 8-fold divisions of my manifestation, and later refers to these 8 as my lower manifestation. The mental world is the domain of the real man, the word man deriving from the Sanskrit root man, the root of the verb to think, signifying thinker. He is named for his most defining attribute, intelligence. The mental world is therefore the realm of our origin, the place to which we truly belong, as our natural environment is that of ideas, not physical phenomena. When the thinker became incarnate in a physical body prepared for him, the senseless animal was transformed into a thinking being through the manas that entered and dwelt within him. Man thus became clothed in his physical form after descending into matter, in order to partake of the tree of knowledge and attain divinity. Consequently, man serves as the link between the divine and the animal. The mental world is particularly significant not only because man, once his mind is sufficiently developed, spends almost all his time there, descending into the physical realm only for brief mortal existence, but also because it serves as the meeting place of higher and lower consciousness. In English, the word mind refers both to the intellectual consciousness itself and to the effects it produces on the physical brain. In occultism, however, the intellectual consciousness must be understood as an individual entity, a being whose life vibrations are thoughts expressed not as words but as images. The true man is Manas, the thinker, operating on the higher or causal levels of the mental plane. Only a small portion of his vibrations, and that imperfectly, can be reproduced in the comparatively coarse physical materials, with the brain and nervous system able to reflect only a fraction of the vast series of mental vibrations generated by the thinker in his own realm. Highly receptive brains respond to what is termed great intellectual power, unresponsive brains reach what is called idiocy, and exceptionally responsive brains achieve what is called genius. A person's mental abilities thus indicate the brain's sensitivity to the countless thought waves from the thinker to which it can respond. Consciousness operating in the brain is therefore illuminated by ideas originating not from the physical world, but reflected directly from the universal mind. The great laws of thought govern all thinking, and the act of thinking demonstrates their pre-existence, as it occurs through and under them and is impossible without them. Viewed more broadly, the mental plane reflects the universal mind in nature, corresponding within our system to the great mind of the cosmos. This great mind is Mahat, the third logos or divine creative intelligence, the Brahma of the Hindus, the Manjushri of the northern Buddhists, and the Holy Spirit of Christians. The universal mind contains all archetypal forms, serving as the source of beings, the fountain of creative energies, and the repository in which all archetypal forms are stored and subsequently elaborated in lower forms of matter during the evolution of the universe. These are the fruits of past universes brought over as seeds for unfoldment in the present universe. It is on the higher part of the mental plane that exist the archetypal ideas which are now in course of concrete evolution. In its lower regions, these are worked out into successive forms, to be duly reproduced in the astral and physical worlds. An example of these ideas is that of the small artificial elementals, which may sometimes be seen hanging around a plant or flower, all through the time that the buds are forming. These are thought forms of the great Devas who supervise the evolution of the vegetable kingdom, and are created for the special purpose of carrying out their ideas connected with the plants and flowers. Such an elemental usually takes the form of an etheric model of the flower itself, or of a little creature which gradually builds the flower into the shape and color of which the Deva has thought. When the work is done, the power of the elemental is exhausted, and the matter of which it is composed dissolves into the general store of such matter. These artificial elementals must not, of course, be confused with nature spirits, which are frequently seen playing about flowers. Before the Manu of a chain or round commences the task appointed for him, he examines the part of that mighty thought form of the Logos which refers to his work, and brings it down to some level within easy reach for constant reference. The same thing is done at a lower level by the Manu of each world and of each root race. Each Manu then builds as nearly as he can to the model he has before him, usually approaching the perfection required by degrees, the earlier efforts at the formation of a race, for example, being often only partially successful. At the beginning of the present round, all the archetypes for humanity were brought down, including those races which have not yet come into existence. From an examination of these, it is possible to see what the men of the future will be like. They will have finer vehicles in every way, and will be distinctly more beautiful in appearance, expressing in their forms the spiritual forces. It was on Globe A in the fourth round that mind became definite on the lower mental level, and so we may say that it is in this round man began really to think. The result at first was by no means good. In previous rounds, he had not been sufficiently developed to originate thought forms to any great extent, and so the elemental essence of the globes had been affected only by the thoughts of the Devas, who left everything harmonious and peaceful. But when man began to interject his selfish and jarring thoughts, this comfortable condition was very largely disturbed. Strife, unrest, and disharmony were introduced, and the animal kingdom drew decisively apart from man, and began to feel fear and hatred towards him. On Globe A there were also the group souls of animals and vegetables and even minerals. It is, of course, difficult for us to conceive what a mineral could be on the mental plane. It would correspond to our thought of a mineral, but the thought form which exists there is that of the Manu, and is molded by a power altogether beyond comparison with that of our mentality. As we saw in Chapter 2, in the natural course of events, the present fourth round should be devoted chiefly to the cultivation of the emotions. The next round, the fifth, should be that of intellectual advancement. We are, however, a long way in advance of the program marked out for us. This advance is entirely due to those august beings variously called the Lords of the Flame, the Children of the Fire Mist, the Lords of Venus, who came to this earth from the planet Venus. Most of them stayed with us only through that critical period of our history. A few still remain to hold the highest offices in the Great White Brotherhood, until the time when men of our own evolution shall be able to relieve them of their high office. As was explained in Chapters 7 and 8, the materials of the mental plane are capable of combining, under the impulse of thought vibrations, and can give rise to any combination which thought can construct. Just as iron can be made into a spade or a sword, so can mental matter be shaped into thought forms to help or to injure. In this region, thought and action are thus one and the same thing. Matter is the obedient servant of life, adapting itself to every creative impulse. The mental plane, being that of thought itself, the very home of thought, is thus far nearer reality than any lower plane. For everything that is material is buried and hidden in matter, whatever of reality it may possess being far less obvious and recognizable than it would be when regarded from a higher standpoint. The whole of our solar system being a manifestation of the Logos, every particle in it is part of his vehicles. Hence, all the mental matter in the system constitutes his mental body. This, of course, comprises not only the mental world belonging to each of the physical planets, but also those belonging to each of the astral planets, and in addition the purely mental planets usually called in our chain of worlds globes A and G. It may be noted, parenthetically, that the man of globe A in the first round can hardly be called a man at all. He is a thought. He is what will someday be a mind body, the germ of a mind body, bearing perhaps the same relation to its later possibilities as the embryonic form of an infant after the first month bears to the fully developed human body. At this early stage he has marvelously little consciousness. The matter described above as composing the mental body of the solar logos also composes the mental bodies of the 7 planetary logoi, which are centers of force within the solar logos. Now, in every man's mental body there are particles belonging to each one of the 7 planetary logoi, but the proportions vary infinitely, these proportions determining the type of each person. In the 7 planetary logoi certain psychic changes periodically occur, and these changes are bound to affect the bodies of every man in the world, because the materials of his bodies are also the materials of the planetary logoi. The degree to which he will be affected will, of course, depend upon the proportion in his bodies of the type of matter appropriate to that particular logos. Hence the importance to man of the motions of these planetary spirits, and the ultimate rationale of astrological science. The influences belonging to these great types affect, amongst other things, the elemental essence which, as we have seen, is vividly active in the astral and mental bodies of men. Hence, any unusual excitement of any of these types must affect to some extent either man's emotions or his mind, or both, to a degree corresponding to the amount of the particular type of essence concerned which he possesses in his vehicles. Such influences in themselves are no more good nor evil than any other natural force. They may be helpful or hurtful according to the use we make of them. It is important to realize that any pressure these influences may bring to bear on man cannot dominate his will in the slightest degree. The most it can do is in some cases to make it easier or more difficult for that will to act along certain lines. A man of iron determination or a student of occultism may put these influences aside as a negligible quantity. For men of weaker will it may sometimes be worthwhile to know at what moment this or that force can most advantageously be applied. The wise man rules his stars. The fool obeys them. Whilst each physical globe has its physical, astral, and mental planes, all interpenetrating one another, and therefore occupying the same space, all of these are yet quite apart, and do not communicate with the corresponding planes of any globe. Notwithstanding the above, there is a condition of the atomic matter of each of these planes which is cosmic in its extent. In fact, the 7 atomic subplanes of our system, taken apart from the rest, may be said to constitute the lowest cosmic plane, sometimes called the cosmic Prakritic. Thus our mental plane is the 3rd subdivision of the lowest cosmic plane. Regarded in another way, the atomic part of our mental plane is also the lowest subplane of the mental body of the planetary logos. The astral plane of the Earth extends to a little less than the mean distance of the Moon, the Earth and the Moon being nearly 240,000 miles apart. The mental plane of the Earth, which is of course a definite globe, extends still further into space than does the astral plane, bearing about the same proportion to the astral as does the astral to the physical. Only that portion of the atomic matter of the astral and mental planes which is in an entirely free condition is coextensive with the interplanetary ether. Consequently, a person can no more pass from planet to planet of our chain in his astral or mental body than he can in his physical body. In the causal body, when very highly developed, this achievement is possible, though not with the ease and rapidity with which it can be done at the Buddhic level. Furthermore, the detailed sight of other planets would not be possible for any system of clairvoyance connected with the mental or any lower plane, though a good deal of information could be obtained by exercising a high magnifying power. Matter of the lower planes is never carried over from planet to planet. When, for example, we leave this planet in order to incarnate upon Mercury, only the egos will be carried over. Those egos will draw around themselves mental and astral matter belonging to their new planet, and will obtain physical bodies provided by those who are already inhabiting Mercury. The matter of the mental plane is divided into 7 grades of fineness, precisely as is that of the astral and the physical planes. For want of other terms, these must for the present be denoted by the terms given to the 7 grades of physical matter: solid, liquid, gaseous, etc. The highest or finest subdivision consists, of course, of ultimate mental atoms. An ultimate mental atom contains 49 to the 4th or 576, 4801 bubbles in koilon. The 3 higher grades of mental matter are called arupa or formless. The 4 lower grades are termed rupa or having form. The distinction is a real one, being related to the divisions on the mind itself. In the rupa levels, the vibrations of consciousness give rise to images or pictures, every thought appearing as a living shape. In the arupa levels, consciousness seems rather to send out flashes or streams of living energy, which does not body itself into distinct images, while it remains on its own levels, but which, when it rushes into the lower mental levels, sets up a variety of forms, all linked by some common condition. In other words, the arupa levels are concerned with the expression of abstract thoughts, ideas, principles, and the rupa levels with concrete thoughts and particular ideas. Words being largely symbols of images, and belonging to the workings of the lower mind in the brain, it follows that it is almost, if not quite, impossible to describe in words the workings of abstract thought. For the arupa levels pertain to the pure reason, which does not work within the narrow limits of language. Another broad distinction between the rupa and the arupa levels of the mental plane is that on the rupa levels a man lives in his own thoughts and fully identifies himself with his personality in the life which he has recently quitted. On the Arupa levels, he is simply the reincarnating ego who, provided he is sufficiently developed on that level to know anything at all, understands, at least to some extent, the evolution upon which he is engaged, and the work that he has to do. Mental matter being so much finer than either astral or physical matter, it follows that the life forces on the mental plane are enormously increased in activity. Mental matter is in constant, ceaseless motion, taking form under every thrill of life and adapting itself readily to every change of motion. Even astral matter seems relatively heavy and lusterless. The vibrations of mental matter are as much more rapid than physical vibrations as vibrations of light are more rapid than physical vibrations as vibrations of light are more rapid than those of sound. We might say that mental matter moves actually with thought. Astral matter moves so quickly after thought that the ordinary observer can scarcely note any difference. Etheric matter, of course, does not obey thought as rapidly as does astral matter. The student will of course realize that just as each particle of physical ether floats in a sea of astral matter, so each astral particle floats in a mental ocean. In spite of the idea, entertained by many people, that it is easier to deal with things on the physical plane than with those on the astral or mental planes, the reverse is the truth. For the very fineness of mental matter, and its ready response to mental impulses, makes it far easier to move and to direct by the action of the will than either astral or physical matter. In the voice of the silence, three halls are spoken of: the hall of ignorance, the hall of learning, the hall of wisdom. It seems probable that the hall of ignorance stands for the physical plane, the hall of learning for the astral and lower mental planes, and the hall of wisdom for the planes of higher mind and buddhi. On the four lower levels of the mental plane, some degree of illusion is still possible, but less it appears, for the man who can function there in full consciousness during physical life than for the undeveloped person after death, as was explained in the chapters on devotion. The lower mental plane is thus still a region of personality and error. In it, as well as in the astral world, there is a serpent coiled under every flower, for if personal and foolish desires infest the one, pride and prejudice inhabit the other. On the higher mental plane, though there will be much that the ego does not know, what he does know he knows correctly. With the life of the causal body, however, we are not directly concerned in this volume. There is a radical difference between the lower and higher mental planes. In the lower mental, matter is dominant. It is the first thing that strikes the eye, and consciousness shines with difficulty through the forms. But in the higher planes, life is the prominent thing, and forms are there only for its purposes. The difficulty in the lower plane is to give life expression in the forms, but in the higher it is quite the reverse, to hold and give form to the flood of life. It is only above the line that divides the lower from the higher mental plane that the light of consciousness is subject to no wind, and shines with its own power. Hence the symbol of a spiritual fire is very fitting for consciousness at the higher levels, as distinguished from the lower planes, where the symbol of fire burning fuel is more appropriate. In the case of the astral plane, it is possible to give some account of its scenery, but this cannot be done for the mental plane because the mental plane has no scenery, except such as each individual chooses to make for himself by his thought. We do not, of course, include as scenery other mental entities who are themselves in many cases objects of great beauty. The conditions of the mental plane, however, are so difficult to describe in words that it would perhaps be more accurate to say that all possible scenery exists there. There is nothing conceivable of loveliness which is not there with a fullness and intensity beyond all power of imagination. But out of this splendor of living reality each man sees only that which his development enables him to perceive. It is said to be difficult to describe the difference between the matter of the various subplanes of the mental world, because the scribe bankrupts himself of adjectives in his attempt to describe the lowest subplane, and thus has no words left for the description of the higher subplanes. All that can be said is that as we ascend, the material becomes finer, the harmonies fuller, the light more living and transparent. There are more overtones in the sound, more delicate shades in the colors, more and new colors appear as we rise through the subplanes. It has been said poetically and truly that the light of a lower plane is darkness on the one above it. On the highest subplane, the matter is ensouled and vivified by an energy which flows like light from above, from the Buddhic plane. As we descend through each subplane, the matter of each subplane becomes the energy of the subplane immediately below, more accurately, the original energy plus the matter of the higher subplanes becomes the ensouling energy of the next lower subplane. Thus, the seventh or lowest subplane consists of the original energy 6 times enclosed or veiled, and therefore by so much weaker and less active. The first impressions of one who enters the mental plane in full consciousness will be very much as described in Chapter 20, when dealing with a man awakening after astral death in Devotion. He will experience intense bliss, indescribable vitality, enormously increased power, and the perfect confidence which flows from these. He finds himself in the midst of what seems to him a whole universe of ever-changing light, color, and sound. He will seem to be floating in a sea of living light, surrounded by every conceivable variety of loveliness in color and form, the whole changing with every wave of thought that he sends out from his mind, and being indeed, as he will discover, only the expression of his thought in the matter of the plane and its elemental essence. Concrete thoughts, as we saw previously, take the shapes of their objects, while abstract ideas usually represent themselves by all kinds of perfect and most beautiful geometrical forms. In this connection, it should be remembered that many thoughts, which to us on the physical plane are little more than mere abstractions, are on the mental plane concrete facts. The feeling of freedom in the mental world is so great that in comparison with it, astral life seems a state of bondage. Anyone who wishes to abstract himself from his surroundings on the mental plane and devote himself to quiet thought may live in a world of his own without possibility of interruption. He will also have the additional advantage of seeing all his ideas and their consequences full worked out, passing before him in a sort of panorama. If, however, he wishes instead to observe the plane upon which he is, he must very carefully suspend his own thought for a time, so that he may not influence the readily impressible matter around him. Having attained to that condition in which he is no longer himself the center of radiation of that light, color, sound, and form, it has not therefore ceased to exist. On the contrary, its harmonies and coruscations are grander than ever. Presently he will perceive that he is seeing the color language of the devas, the expression of thought or conversation of beings far higher than himself in the scale of evolution. By experiment and practice he will also find that he can himself use this mode of expression, and thus hold converse with, and learn from, these lofty non-human entities, whom we shall describe in a later chapter. For, as the student will recollect, a thought form, composed of rapidly vibrating particles of mental matter, sets up vibrations all around it, and these vibrations give rise to sensations of sound and color in any entities adapted to translate them thus. It is possible also for a visitor to the mental plane to form round himself a huge shell, through which none of the thought or conversation of other entities can penetrate. Then, holding his own mind perfectly still, he can examine the conditions inside his shell. He is now able to perceive another, and entirely different series of regular pulsations, which the other more artificial phenomena had obscured. These are universal and cannot be checked or turned aside by any shell made by human power. They produce no color or form, but flow with resistless regularity through all the matter of the plane, outwards and in again, like the exhalations and inhalations of a great breath. There are several sets of these, clearly distinguishable from one another by volume, period of vibration, and the tone of the harmony which they bring. Grander than them all sweeps one great wave which seems the very heartbeat of the system, a wave which, welling up from unknown centers on far higher planes, pours out its life through all our world, and then draws back in its tremendous tide to that from which it came. It comes in one long undulating curve, and the sound of it is like the murmur of the sea. Yet in it and through it there echoes a ringing chant of triumph, the very music of the spheres. A man who has once heard that glorious song of nature never quite loses it again. Even in the physical world, so dreary by comparison, he hears it always as a kind of undertone. If the man has reached a certain degree of spiritual development, it is possible for him to merge his consciousness with the sweep of the wave and let it bear him upward to its source. But it is not wise to do this, unless a master stands beside him to draw him back at the right moment, for otherwise its irresistible force will carry him away into still higher planes, whose far greater glories his ego is as yet unable to sustain. He will lose consciousness with no certainty as to when and where he will regain it. Whilst the attainment of such unity is the ultimate object of man's evolution, he must reach that goal in full and perfect consciousness, and not drift into absorption in a state of blank unconsciousness but little removed from annihilation. On the mental plane, a man may circle the world with the speed of thought. He is at the other side of it even as he formulates the wish to be there, for the response of mental matter to thought is immediate, and it is very readily controlled by the will. On the mental plane there is no alternation of day and night, and nothing to correspond to sleeping or waking, except of course on first entering the plane and on finally leaving it. As the physical world is three-dimensional, and the astral world four-dimensional, so is the mental world five-dimensional. But, as was explained in the astral body, it is probably more accurate to say that consciousness on each plane is able to appreciate the world in which it is functioning in the number of dimensions given above. The three known forms of energy have their appropriate manifestations on every plane which our students have yet reached. Hence Fohat, Prana, and Kundalini all exist on the mental plane. Thought at present little is known of the details of their workings. A man in full consciousness on the mental plane will, of course, see the whole of humanity, excepting those who are living in their causal bodies only, for every man who is in physical or astral life must also possess a mental body. Those, however, who are confined in their own shells of thoughts in their heavens can scarcely be considered as companions, for reasons explained in the chapters on devotion. Between those who are fully conscious on the mental plane there is far closer union than is possible at any lower level. A man can no longer deceive another with regard to what he thinks, for all mental operations lie open for everyone to see. Opinions or impressions can now be exchanged not only with the quickness of thought but also with perfect accuracy, for each now receives the exact idea of the other, clean, clear-cut, instantaneous, without having to puzzle his way through the maze of words. The student will recollect that, on the astral plane, difference of language is a barrier to communication, as thoughts must be definitely formulated in words in order to be comprehensible to another entity on that plane. On the mental plane, however, men communicate directly by thought transference, whatever their language may be. Space is no barrier, for a man can come into touch with any other man merely by directing his attention to him. The real barrier between men are those due to the difference in their evolution. The less evolved can know only as much of the more evolved as he is able to respond to, and such limitations can obviously be felt only by the more evolved, as the lesser has all he can contain. The method of finding a man on the mental plane, whether he be living or dead, is as follows. For each of a man's vehicles there is what may be called a keynote, a sort of average tone of the man's various forces and qualities on the plane concerned. There have never been found two persons whose keynotes were identical at all levels, etheric, astral, mental, and causal, so as to make the same chord when struck simultaneously. Thus the chord of each man is unique, and whether he be sleeping or waking, living or dead, his chord is always the same, and he can always be found by it. If the man is in the higher world, in his causal body alone, he still has his chord with him, because his permanent atoms are quite sufficient to give out the distinctive sound. The trained seer, who is able to sense the chord, attunes his own vehicles for the moment exactly to its notes, and then by an effort of will sends forth its sound. Wherever in the three worlds the man sought may be, there is an instantaneous response from him. His causal body lights up instantly, like a great flame, and this is at once visible to the seer, so that a magnetic line of communication is established. The seer can use that line as a kind of telescope, or, if he prefers, he can send his consciousness flashing along it with the speed of light, and see from the other end of it, as it were. The man's chord is his true occult name. Some vague tradition of this is probably the origin of the belief among certain savages that a man's real name must be concealed, lest magic be worked upon him. Thus also it is said that at each initiation the man's true name is changed, since each initiation is at once the official recognition and the fulfillment of a progress by which the man, as it were, has raised himself into a higher key, so that thenceforward his chord must be sounded differently. This name of the man must not be confused with the name of the ogoids, for that is the chord of the three principles of the ego, produced by the vibrations of the atmic, buddhic, and mental atoms, and the monad behind them. The chord is not actually either heard or seen, it is received by a complex perception which requires the practically simultaneous activity of the consciousness in the causal body and in all the lower vehicles. Thus every man pronounces his own true name. Just as he has his own odor materially, by which a bloodhound can track him, so he has his sound spiritually. Those who can hear that sound of his in the inner worlds know where he stands on the ladder of evolution, and what he can and cannot do. Freemasons will recognize the chord as the man's own knock, his own report, made by the tap of the inner self, that opens for the man the way into the true lodge. The ogoids, the glorified man, is a name sometimes given to the three higher principles of a man, Atma Buddhi Manas, which constitute the ego in the causal body. This, of course, is not an image of any one of the man's past vehicles, but contains within itself the essence of all that was best in each of them. It is the body which indicates more or less perfectly, as through experience it grows, what the deity means that man shall be. From that vehicle, on the causal levels, it is possible to see not only what the man's past history has been, but also to a considerable extent the future that lies before him. Chapter 28. Glimpse into life on the higher mental plane. No description of the mental plane would be complete without addressing what are called the Akashic records. They represent the only reliable history of the world and are often referred to as the memory of nature, as well as the true karmic records, or the book of the Lipika. The term Akashic is somewhat misleading, For although the records are accessed through the akasha, or matter of the mental plane, they do not truly belong to that plane. An even less accurate term, often used in earlier literature, was records of the astral light, since they exist far beyond the astral plane, only glimpsed in fragments there, as will be explained. The term akashic is appropriate only because it is on the mental plane that one first makes definite contact with the records and is able to work with them reliably. The student is aware that as an individual develops, the causal body, which defines the limit of the aura, grows in size as well as in luminosity and purity of color. Extending this idea to an immensely higher level leads to the understanding that the solar logos encompasses the entirety of our solar system. Therefore, everything that occurs within the system exists within the consciousness of the logos, making the true record his memory. It is also evident that regardless of the plane on which this memory exists, it must be far beyond anything known to us. Consequently, any records we are able to access are merely reflections of the great original, mirrored in the denser media of the lower planes. These records are known on the Buddhic, mental, and astral planes and will be described in reverse order. On the astral plane, the reflection is extremely imperfect. The records visible there are highly fragmentary and often seriously distorted. The analogy of water, frequently used to symbolize the astral world, is particularly pertinent. A clear reflection on still water is, at best, only a reflection, representing three-dimensional objects in two dimensions, showing only shape and color, and reversing the objects. If the water is disturbed, the reflection is broken and distorted, rendering it nearly useless and even misleading as a guide to the actual form of the objects. On the astral plane, there is never anything approaching a still surface. Instead, one must contend with constant and chaotic motion, preventing clear and precise reflection. Thus, a clairvoyant with only astral sight can never rely on any depiction of the past as entirely accurate. Some portions may be correct, but there is no way to identify them. Through prolonged and careful training, such an individual may learn to differentiate reliable from unreliable impressions and reconstruct an image from fragmented reflections. However, long before mastering these challenges, the development of mental sight generally makes such efforts unnecessary. On the mental plane, conditions differ greatly. The record is complete and accurate, and reading it cannot result in error. Multiple clairvoyants using mental sight and examining the same record would see identical reflections and each would gain a correct impression. With the faculties of the causal body, reading the records becomes even easier. It appears that for perfection in reading, the ego must be fully awakened to utilize the atomic matter of the mental plane. It is well known that when several people witness the same event on the physical plane, their accounts often vary significantly due to imperfect observation, each attending only to the aspects that most attract attention. This personal equation would not appreciably affect the impressions received in the case of an observation on the mental plane. For each observer would thoroughly grasp the entire subject, and so it would be impossible for him to see its parts out of due proportion. Error, however, may be easily occur in transferring the impressions received to the lower planes. The reasons for this we may group roughly as those due to the observer himself, and those due to the inherent difficulty, or rather impossibility, of performing the task perfectly. In the nature of things, only a small fraction of the experience on the mental plane could be expressed in physical worlds at all. Hence, since all expression must be partial, there is obviously some possibility of choice in selecting the part expressed. For this reason, Clairvoyant investigations by leading theosophists are constantly checked and verified by more than one investigator before they are published. Apart from the personal equation, however, there are still the difficulties inherent in bringing impressions down from a higher to a lower plane. In order to understand this, the analogy of the art of painting is useful. A painter has to endeavor to reproduce a three-dimensional object on a flat surface, which of course has only two dimensions. Even the most perfect picture is in reality almost infinitely far from being a reproduction of the scene it represents. For hardly a single line or angle in it can ever be the same as those in the object copied. It is simply a highly ingenious attempt to make upon one sense only, by means of lines and colors on a flat source, an impression similar to that which the actual scene depicted would make upon us. It can convey to us nothing, except by suggestion dependent on our own previous experience, of, for example, the roar of the sea, the scent of flowers, the taste of fruit, the hardness or softness of surfaces. Far greater are the difficulties experienced by a clairvoyant in endeavoring to express mental phenomena in physical plane language. For, as was mentioned in an earlier chapter, the mental world is five-dimensional. The appearance of the records varies to a certain extent, according to the conditions under which they are seen. Upon the astral plane, the reflection is usually a simple picture, though occasionally the figure seen would be endowed with motion. In this case, instead of a mere snapshot, a rather longer and more perfect reflection has taken place. On the mental plane, they have two widely different aspects. First, if the observer is not thinking specially of them, the records simply form a background to whatever is going on. Under such conditions, they are really merely reflections from the ceaseless activity of a great consciousness upon a far higher plane, and have very much the appearance of cinematography pictures. The action of the reflected figures constantly goes on, as though one were watching the actors on a distant stage. Second, if the trained observer turns his attention specially to any one scene, then, this being the plane of unhampered thought, it is instantly brought before him. Thus, if he wished to see the landing in Britain of Julius Caesar, in a moment he finds himself not looking at a picture, but actually standing on the shore among the legionaries, with the whole scene being enacted around him, precisely as he would have seen it had he been there when it occurred in 55 before Christ. The actors are of course entirely unconscious of him, as they are but reflections, nor can any effort of his change the course of their action in any way. But he has the power of controlling the rate at which the drama shall pass before him. He could thus have the events of a year take place before him in 1 hour. He could also stop the movement at any moment and hold any particular scene in view as long as he chooses. Not only does he see all that he would have seen physically, had he been present when the events occurred, but he hears and understands what the people say, and he is conscious of their thoughts and motives. There is one special case where an investigator can enter into an even closer sympathy with the records. If he is observing a scene in which he himself took part in a previous life, there are two possibilities open to him. He may regard it in the usual manner, just as a spectator, though a spectator whose insight and sympathy are perfect, or he may once more identify himself with that long-dead personality of his and experience over again the thought and emotions of that time. He recovers, in fact, from the universal consciousness, that portion with which he has himself been associated. The student will readily perceive the wonderful possibilities that open up before the man who is in full possession of the power to read the Akashic records at will. He can review at leisure all history, correcting the many errors and misconceptions which have crept into the accounts handed down by historians. He can also watch, for example, the geological changes that have taken place and the cataclysms which have altered the face of the earth many times. It is usually possible to determine the date of any record which may be examined, but it may require considerable pains and ingenuity. There are many ways of doing this. The observer may look into the mind of an intelligent person present in the picture and see what date he supposes it to be. He may observe the date, written in a letter or document. As soon as he has secured the date, say, according to the Roman or Grecian system of chronology, it is of course merely a matter of calculation to reduce it to the present accepted system. He may turn to some contemporary record, the date of which can easily be ascertained from ordinary historical sources. In comparatively recent times, there is usually no great difficulty in ascertaining the date. But in much older times, other methods have to be adopted. Even if the date can be read in the mind of someone living in the picture, there may be difficulty in relating his system of dates to that of the observer. In such cases, the observer may run the records before him and count the years from a date that is known. In such cases, it is of course necessary to form some approximate idea from the general appearance and surroundings of the period, in order that he may not have too long a series of years to count. Where the years run into thousands, the above method would be too tedious to be practical. The observer, as an alternative, can notice the point in the heavens to which the axis of the earth is pointing, and calculate the date from the known data concerning that secondary rotation of the earth, known as the precession of the equinoxes. In extremely early records of events which took place millions of years ago, the period of the precession of the equinoxes can be used as a unit. In these instances, absolute accuracy is not required. Hence, the date in round numbers is sufficient for all practical purposes in dealing with such remote epochs. The accurate numbering of the records is possible only after careful training. As we have seen, mental sight is necessary before any reliable reading can be done. In fact, to minimize the possibility of error, mental sight ought to be fully at the command of the investigator while awake in the physical body, and to obtain this years of labor and rigid self-discipline are necessary. Moreover, as the true records lie on a plane at present far beyond our ken, to comprehend them perfectly demands faculties of a far higher order than any which humanity has yet evolved. Hence, our present view of the whole subject must necessarily be imperfect, because we are looking at it from below instead of from above. The Akashic records must not be confused with mere man-made thought forms, which exist in such abundance on both the mental and astral planes. Thus, for example, as we saw in Chapter 8, any great historical event, having been constantly thought of and vividly imaged by large numbers of people, exists as a definite thought form on the mental plane. The same applies to characters in drama, fiction, etc. Such products of thought are much easier to see than the true Akashic record, for, as we have said, to read the records requires training, whilst to see thought forms needs nothing but a glimpse of the mental plane. Hence, many visions of saints, seer, etc., are not of the true records but merely of thought forms. One method of reading the records is by means of psychometry. It appears that there is a sort of magnetic attachment or affinity between any particle of matter and the record which contains history. Every particle, in fact, bears within it forever the impress of everything that has occurred in its neighborhood. This affinity enables it to act as a kind of conductor between the record and the faculties of anyone who can read it. The untrained clairvoyant usually cannot read the records without some such physical link to put him en rapport with the subject required. Such a method of exercising clairvoyance is psychometry. Thus, if a fragment of stone belonging, say, to Stonehenge is given to a psychometer, he will see and be able to describe the ruins and the country surrounding them. In addition, he will probably also be able to see some of the past events with which Stonehenge was associated, such as Druidical ceremonies, for example. It is quite probable that ordinary memory is but another expression of the same principle. The scenes through which we pass in the course of our lives seem to act upon the cells of the brain in such a way as to establish a connection between those cells and the portion of the records with which we have been associated, and so we remember what we have seen. Even a trained clairvoyant needs a link to enable him to find the record of an event of which he has no previous knowledge. There are several ways in which this may be done. Thus, if he has visited the scene of the event, he may call up the image of the spot and then run through the records until he reaches the period desired. If he has not seen the place in question, he may run back in time to the date of the event and then search for what he wants. He may examine the records of the period, when he will have no difficulty in identifying any prominent person connected with the event. Then he can run through the records of that person till he comes to the event for which he was looking. We thus see that the power to read the memory of nature exists in men in many degrees. There are the few trained clairvoyants who can consult the records for themselves at will, the psychometer who needs an object connected with the past in order to bring him into touch with the past, the person who gets occasional spasmodic glimpses of the past, the crystal gazer who can sometimes direct his less certain astral telescope to some scene of long ago. Many of the lower manifestations of these powers are exercised unconsciously. Thus many a crystal gazer watches scenes from the past, without being able to distinguish them from visions of the present. Other vaguely psychic persons find pictures constantly arising before their eyes, without ever realizing that they are actually psychometrizing the various objects which happen to be around them. A variant of this class of psychic is the man who is able to psychometrize persons only, instead of inanimate objects, as is more usual. In most cases, this faculty shows itself erratically. Such psychics will sometimes, when they meet a stranger, see in a flash some prominent event in that stranger's life. On other occasions, they will receive no special impression. More rarely are found persons who get detailed visions of the past life of everyone they encounter. One of the best examples of this class is probably that of the German Schock, who describes his remarkable faculty circumstantially in his autobiography. Although it is outside the scope of this book to treat of the Buddhic plane, yet for the sake of completeness, and in this once instance, it may be well briefly to refer to the records as they exist on the Buddhic plane. The records, referred to as the memory of nature, are on the plane of buddhi very much more than a memory in the ordinary sense of the word. On this plane, time and space are no longer limitations. The observer no longer needs to pass a series of events in review, for past and present as well as future are all alike and simultaneously present to him, for he is in what is called the eternal now, meaningless as such a phrase may sound on the physical plane. Infinitely below the consciousness of the logos as even the Buddhic plane is, it is abundantly clear that the record is not merely a memory, for all that has happened in the past or that will happen in the future is happening now before his eyes, just as much as are the events of what we call the present. Incredible as this may sound, it is nevertheless true. A simple and purely physical analogy may help to a partial understanding, not indeed of the future, but of the past and present being visible simultaneously. Let the following two premises only be granted: that physical light can travel at its usual speed indefinitely into space without loss; that the logos, being omnipresent, must be at every point in space, not successively but simultaneously; Granting these premises, it necessarily follows that everything which has ever happened, from the very beginning of the world, must at this very moment be taking place before the eyes of the Logos, not a mere memory of it, but the actual occurrence itself being now under his observation. Further, by a simple movement of consciousness through space, he would not only be continuously conscious of every event that had ever happened, but would also be conscious of every event happening, at any speed he chooses, either forwards or backwards. The illustration, however, as stated, does not appear to throw any light on the problem of seeing the future, which for the present must remain unexplained, based, apart from metaphysical considerations, solely on the statements of those who have themselves been able to exercise, in some degree, the faculty of seeing future events. The future cannot be seen as clearly as the past, for the faculty to see the future belongs to a still higher plane. Moreover, although prevision is to a great extent possible on the mental plane, yet it is not perfect, because wherever in the web of destiny the hand of the developed man comes in, his powerful will may introduce new threads, and change the pattern of the life to come. The course of the ordinary undeveloped man, who has practically no will of his own worth speaking of, may often be foreseen enough, but when the ego boldly takes his future into his own hands, exact prevision becomes impossible. A man who can use his atmic body can contact the universal memory beyond the limits even of his own chain. On page 88 we mentioned one possible cause of plagiarism. Another cause, which sometimes occurs, is that two writers happening to see the same Akashic record at the same time. In this case, they not only apparently plagiarize each other, but also, though each thinks himself the creator of a plot, a situation, etc., both are actually plagiarizing the world's true history. Chapter 29. Relationship between personality and ego. In classifying the inhabitants of the mental plane, we shall adopt the same system used for the astral plane. Human, non-human, and artificial. Since the products of human evil passions, which dominate the astral world, cannot exist on the mental plane, the subdivisions to be considered are naturally far fewer than those of astral entities. The main classes are outlined as follows. Human entities are divided for convenience into embodied, those still attached to a physical body and alive, and those who are dead, lacking a physical body. Embodied humans who, while still connected to a physical body, can move with full consciousness and activity on the mental plane are either adepts or their initiated pupils, for a student cannot move freely even on the lower levels of the mental plane until instructed by a master in the use of the mental body. Adepts and initiates appear as brilliant globes of living color, dispelling all evil influence in their vicinity and radiating a sense of restfulness and happiness, perceptible even to those who cannot see them. Much of their most important work is conducted on the mental plane, particularly at higher levels where the individuality or ego can be directly influenced. From this plane, they project the greatest spiritual influences upon the world of thought and direct beneficent movements of every kind. Here also is distributed much of the spiritual force generated by the self-sacrifice of the Nirmanakas, and direct instruction is given to pupils advanced enough to receive it in this manner, as it is imparted far more effectively and completely than on the astral plane. Additionally, they have extensive work in relation to the dead. Adepts or masters generally reside on the highest, atomic level of the mental plane, but most who reach the Aseka level no longer retain physical, astral, mental, or causal bodies, instead existing permanently at their highest level. When interaction with a lower plane is necessary, they surround themselves with a temporary vehicle of matter from that plane. To better understand the conditions of the mental plane and its inhabitants, It is also important to mention those who are absent from it. The mental world is characterized by unselfishness and spirituality, so black magicians and their pupils have no place there. Although many possess highly developed intellects, with extremely active and sensitive mental matter along certain lines, these lines are always tied to personal desire. Their expression is confined to the lower portion of the mental body, entangled with astral matter. Consequently, their activities are essentially limited to the astral and physical planes. An individual whose life is wholly evil and selfish may occasionally engage in purely abstract thought and utilize the mental body if skilled in doing so, but the moment personal motives enter and effort is directed toward an evil result, thought ceases to be abstract, and the individual finds himself operating once again in conjunction with familiar astral matter. One might therefore say that a black magician could function on the mental plane only while he forgot that he was a black magician. But even while he forgot it, he could be visible on the mental plane only to men functioning there consciously, never by any possibility to people in devotion, who are entirely secluded in a world of their own thoughts, into which nothing of an unpleasant or evil character can intrude from without. For ordinary people during sleep or for psychically developed persons in trance to penetrate to the mental plane is just possible, though extremely rare. Purity of life and purpose would be an absolutely prerequisite, and even when the plane was reached there would be nothing that could be called real consciousness, but simply a capacity for receiving certain impressions. An example of this was given in the chapter on sleep life. Human, disembodied. This class comprises all those in devotion who have already been described in the chapters dealing with that condition. And human. It was mentioned in the astral body that there are occasionally found on the astral plane certain cosmic entities, visitors from other planets and systems. Such visitors are very much more frequent on the mental plane. The difficulties of describing such entities in human language are almost insuperable, and the task will therefore not be attempted. They are very lofty beings and are concerned, not with individuals but with great cosmic processes. Those in touch with our world are the immediate agents for the carrying out of the law of karma, especially in connection with changes of land and sea brought about by earthquakes, tidal waves, and all other seismic causes. Rupadevas, the beings known to the Hindus and Buddhists as Devas, to Zoroastrians as the lords of the heavenly and the earthly, to the Christians and Mohammedans as angels, and elsewhere as sons of God, etc., are a kingdom of spirits belonging to an evolution distinct from that of humanity, an evolution in which they may be regarded as a kingdom next above humanity, much as humanity is next above the animal kingdom. There is here, however, an important difference, for whilst an animal can pass only into the human kingdom, a human being, when he attains the Aseka level, has several choices, of which the Deva line is one. Although connected with the earth, Devas are by no means confined to it, for the whole of our chain of 7 worlds is as one world to them, their evolution being through a grand system of 7 chains. Their hosts have hitherto been recruited chiefly from other humanities in the solar system, some lower and some higher than ours, since but a very small portion of our own is sufficiently advanced to be able to join them. It seems certain that some of their very numerous classes have not passed through any humanity at all comparable with ours. It is at present not possible for us to understand very much about them, but it is clear that the aim of their evolution is considerably higher than ours, that is to say, while the level of the Aseka adept is that at which we are aiming at the end of the 7th round, the level attained by the Deva evolution in the corresponding period will be a very much higher one. For them, as for us, there is a steeper but shorter path leading to still more sublime heights. There are at least as many types of angels or devas as there are races of men, and in each type there are many grades of power, of intellect, and of general development, so that altogether there are hundreds of varieties. Angels have been divided into 9 orders, the names used in the Christian Church being angels, archangels, thrones, dominations, princedoms, virtues, powers, cherubim, and seraphim. Of these, 7 belong to the great rays of which the solar system is composed, and 2 may be called cosmic, as they are common to some other systems. In each order there are many types, in each there are some who work, some who assist those in trouble and sorrow, others who work among the vast hosts of the dead, some who guard, some who meditate, while others are at the stage where they are mainly concerned with their own development. There are also angels of music, who express themselves in music as we express ourselves in words. To them an arpeggio is a greeting, a fugue a conversation, an oratorio an oration. There are angels of color, who express themselves by kaleidoscopic changes of glowing hues. There are also angels who live in and express themselves by perfumes and fragrances. A subdivision of this type includes the angels of incense, who are drawn by its vibrations and find pleasure in utilizing its possibilities. There is still another kind, belonging to the kingdom of nature spirits or elves, who do not express themselves by means of perfumes, but who live by and on such emanations and so are always found where fragrance is disseminated. There are many varieties, some feeding upon coarse and loathsome odors, and others only upon those which are delicate and refined. Amongst these are a few types who are especially attracted by the smell of incense, and who are therefore to be found in churches where incense is used. Those who have been taught to know and respond to the ancient call at the preface of the Christian Eucharist and who are charged with the distribution of the force are often called the apostolic or messenger angels. Some of these are thoroughly conversant with this class of work, from long practice. Others are novices eagerly learning what has to be done and how to do it. The method of angelic evolution being largely by service, a ceremony such as the Eucharist offers them a remarkably good opportunity, of which they readily avail themselves. At a low celebration, the directing angel first responds to the call sent out by the priest, and he seems to assemble the rest. At a high celebration or missa cantata, the ancient melody attracts the notice of all immediately that it rings out, and they stand ready to attend at the appropriate time for each. The service rendered by the angels is of very many kinds, only a few bringing them into contact with human beings, mainly in connection with religious ceremonies. The angels invoked in the Christian services are far above men in spiritual development. In Freemasonry also angelic aid is invoked, but those called upon are nearer to the level of men in development and intelligence, and each of them brings with him a number of subordinates who carry out his directions. Every regularly constituted Masonic lodge is in charge of a 7th-ray angel, who directs its affairs. None of the devas have physical bodies such as we have. The lowest kind are called Kamadevas, who have as their lowest body the astral. The next class is that of the Rupadevas, who have bodies of lower mental matter, and who have their habitat on the 4 lower or Rupa levels of the mental plane. The third class is that of the Aripadevas, who live in bodies of higher mental or causal matter. Above these there are 4 other great classes, inhabiting respectively the 4 higher planes of our solar system. Above and beyond the Deva kingdom altogether stand the great hosts of planetary spirits. In this book we are concerned, of course, principally with the Rupadevas. The relationship of devas to nature, spirits somewhat resembles, at a higher level, that of men to animals. Just as an animal can attain individualization only by association with man, So it seems that a nature spirit can normally acquire a permanent reincarnating individuality only by an attachment of a somewhat similar character to devas. Devas will never be human, most of them already beyond that stage, but there are some who have been human beings in the past. The bodies of devas are more fluidic than those of men, being capable of far greater expansion and contraction. They have also a certain fiery quality which clearly distinguishes them from human beings. The fluctuations in the aura of a deva are so great that, for example, the aura of one which was normally about 150 yards in diameter has been observed to expand to about 2 miles in diameter. The colors in the aura of a deva are more of the nature of flame than of cloud. A man looks like an exceedingly brilliant, yet delicate cloud of glowing gas, but a deva looks like a mass of fire. Devas live far more in the circumference, more all over their auras than a man does. Whilst 99% of the matter of a man's aura is within the periphery of his physical body, the proportion is far less in the case of a deva. They usually appear as human beings of gigantic size. They possess vast knowledge, great power, and are most splendid in appearance. They are described as radiant, flashing creatures, myriad-hued, like rainbows of changing supernal colors, of stateliest imperial mien, calm energy incarnate, embodiments of resistless strength. In Revelation, one of them is described as having a rainbow upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. As the sound of many waters are their voices. They guide natural order, their cohorts carrying on ceaselessly the process of nature with regularity and accuracy. Devas produce thought forms as we do, but theirs are usually not so concrete as ours until they reach a high level. They have a wide generalizing nature, and are constantly making gorgeous plans. They have a color language which is probably not as definite as our speech, though in certain ways it may express more. The initiations which we take are not taken by devas. Their kingdom and ours converge at a point higher than the adept. There are ways in which a man can enter the deva evolution, even at our stage or lower. The acceptance of this line of evolution is sometimes spoken of, in comparison with the sublime renunciation of the Nirmanakas, as yielding to the temptation to become a god. But it must not be inferred from this expression that any shadow of blame attaches to the man who makes this choice. The path which he selects is not the shortest, but it is a very noble one, and if his developed intuition impels him toward it, it is certainly the one best suited to his capacities. In Freemasonry, the Deva captain associated with the senior deacon is a Rupadeva, and he employs nature spirits and elemental essence at his own level. The Deva captains corresponding to the 3 principal officers are Aripadevas, who possess the consciousness and wield the forces of the planes which they respectively represent. The Deva of the junior warden takes charge of the 1st degree, the Deva of the senior warden of the 2nd degree, and the Deva of worshipful master of the 3rd degree. Nothing is known of any rule or limit for the work of the Devas. They have more lines of activity than we can imagine. They are usually quite willing to expound and exemplify subjects along their own line to any human being who is sufficiently developed to appreciate them. Much instruction is given in this way, but few are able to profit by it as yet. Whilst Devas are exceedingly beautiful, the lower orders of them have the vaguest and cloudiest conceptions of things, being inaccurate so far as facts are concerned. Hence, while a Deva friend may be an exceedingly interesting person, yet, having no relation to the facts amidst which humanity is evolving, the greatest care should be exercised in following advice he may give as to physical actions. In general, the higher order of devas unreservedly cooperate with the great plan of the universe, hence the perfect order that we find in nature. In the lower ranks, this perfect obedience is instinctive and automatic. Rather than conscious, they do their work, feeling impelled in the direction of the one will which runs through everything. In the case of national devas, whilst the one at the head of each nation is a being of lofty intelligence, who always cooperates with the plan, the lower national devas are found fighting, for example, for their own nation on a battlefield. As their intelligence develops, they cooperate more and more with the plan. The spirit of the earth, that obscure being who has the earth for his body, is not of the highest order of devas. Little is known of him. He may be said to belong more to the Rupa devas, because he has the earth for his body. Devas who are beyond the level of the Aseka adept, that of the fifth initiation, normally live in what is called in Sanskrit the Jnanadaha, or the body of knowledge. The lowest part of that body is an atom of the nirvanic plane, serving them as our physical body serves us. For a description of the four devarajas or regents of the earth, the student is referred to the astral body. In Freemasonry, the four tassels which appear in the corners of the indented border symbolize the devarajas, the rulers of the elements of earth, water, air, and fire, and the agents of the law of karma. Animal group souls. The group souls, to which the vast majority of animals are attached, are found on the lower mental plane. It would take us too far afield to describe the nature of these group souls, so we confine ourselves merely to mentioning them here. Individualized animals. These, together with their state of consciousness on the mental plane, have already been described on page 204. Second elemental kingdom. We have already, in chapter 2, described the genesis of the mental elemental essence. We have also dealt with this essence in its function as part of man's mental body, and also as used in thought forms. Little more, therefore, need be said about it here. There are three elemental kingdoms. The first ensouls matter of the higher mental or causal subplanes, the second, the matter of the four lower levels of the mental plane, the third, astral matter. In the second kingdom, the highest subdivision exists on the fourth subplane, whilst there are two classes on each of the three lower subplanes, thus making in all 7 subdivisions on these 4 subplanes. We have already seen that the mental essence is on the downward arc of evolution, and therefore is less evolved than astral essence or, of course, than any of the later kingdoms, such as the mineral, and we have also emphasized the importance of this fact, which the student should bear constantly in mind. Mental essence is, if possible, even more instantaneously sensitive to thought action than is the astral essence, the wonderful delicacy with which it responds to the faintest action of the mind being constantly and prominently brought to the notice of investigators. It is, of course, in this response that its very life consists, its progress being helped by the use of it by thinking entities. If it could be imagined as entirely free for a moment from the action of thought, it would appear as a formless conglomeration of dancing infinitesimal atoms, instinct with marvelous intensity of life, but probably making but little progress on the downward path of evolution into matter. But when thought seizes upon it, and stirs it into activity, throwing it on the rupa levels into all kinds of lovely forms, it receives a distinct additional impulse which, often repeated, helps it forward on its way. For when a thought is directed from higher levels to the affairs of earth, it sweeps downwards and takes upon itself the matter of the lower planes. In doing this, it brings the elemental essence of which the first veil was formed into contact with that lower matter. Thus, by degrees, the essence becomes accustomed to answer to lower vibrations, and so progresses in its downward evolution into matter. The essence is also very noticeably affected by music, poured forth by great musicians in devotion. It should be clearly recognized that there is a vast difference between the grandeur and power of thought on its own plane and the comparatively feeble effort we know as thought on the physical plane. Ordinary thought originates in the mental body and, as it descends, clothes itself in astral essence. A man who can use his causal body generates his thoughts at that level. These thoughts clothe themselves in lower mental essence, and are consequently infinitely finer, more penetrating, and in every way more effective. If the thought be directed exclusively to higher objects, its vibrations may be too fine to find expression in astral matter, but when they do affect this lower matter, they have far greater effect than those generated so much nearer to the level of that lower matter. Following the idea further, the thought of an initiate takes rise on the Buddhic plane and clothes itself in causal matter. The thought of a master takes its rise on the plane of Atma, wielding the incalculable powers of regions of matter beyond our ordinary ken. Artificial elementals, mental elementals or thought forms, having already been fully described, little further need be said about them. The mental plane is even more fully peopled by artificial elementals than is the astral plane, and they play a large part among the living creatures that function on the mental plane. They are, of course, more radiant and more brilliantly colored than our astral elementals, are stronger, more lasting, and more fully vitalist. When it is also remembered how much grander and more powerful thought is on the mental plane, and that its forces are being wielded not only by human entities, but by devas and by visitors from higher planes, it will be realized that the importance and influence of such artificial entities can scarcely be exaggerated. Great use is made of these mental elementals by masters and initiates, the elementals which they create having, of course, a much longer existence and proportionately greater power than any of those which were described in dealing with the astral plane in the astral body. Chapter 30. Descent and Preparation for New Incarnation. Life in devotion, the heavenly realm, being finite, must inevitably end. This occurs when the ego has absorbed all the essence of experiences gathered during preceding physical and astral lives. All mental faculties expressed through the mental body are then withdrawn into the higher mental or causal body. Along with them, the mental unit, which functions similarly to the physical and astral permanent atoms, is also withdrawn into the causal body, remaining there in latent form until called into renewed activity at the time of rebirth. The mental unit, together with the astral and physical permanent atoms, is enwrapped within the Buddhic life web and stored as a radiant nucleus-like particle in the causal body, representing all that remains to the ego of its lower world bodies. The mental body itself, the final temporary vesture of the true man, the ego, is left behind as a mental corpse, just as the physical and astral bodies were. Its materials disintegrate and return to the general matter of the mental plane. This volume does not focus on the life of the ego on the higher mental or causal plane, yet to avoid leaving the account of human existence between incarnations incomplete, a brief mention may be made of the portion of life spent on the higher mental plane. Every human, upon completing life on the astral and lower mental planes, experiences at least a flash of ego consciousness in the causal body. The more developed, of course, have a distinct conscious period, living as the ego on its own plane. In this momentary flash, the individual perceives the last life as a whole and gathers an impression of success or failure in accomplishing the work intended. Simultaneously, a forecast of the upcoming life is perceived, along with an understanding of the general lesson it will teach or the specific progress to be achieved. The ego awakens only gradually to the significance of these glimpses, yet once understood, they are utilized in planning. Eventually, the ego reaches a stage where this awareness is no longer momentary, allowing more thorough consideration and preparation for the forthcoming life. Further discussion of the ego's life on its own plane must be reserved for the 4th volume of this series, which will address the causal body. Chapter 31. Path to Discipleship and Required Qualities. We now turn to the relationship between the personality and the ego. Since the ego has not yet been examined, a complete investigation of this relationship is not possible at present. In this volume, the discussion must focus primarily on the perspective of the personality rather than that of the ego. The subject will be revisited in the causal body, where it will be treated principally from the viewpoint of the ego. The personality comprises the temporary vehicles through which the true man, the thinker, expresses himself in the physical, astral, and lower mental worlds, namely the physical, astral, and lower mental bodies, along with all activities associated with these vehicles. The individuality is the thinker himself, the self residing in the causal body. Just as a tree produces leaves to endure through spring, summer, and autumn, the individuality produces personalities to last through life periods spent on the physical, astral, and lower mental planes. In the same way that leaves absorb, assimilate, and transfer nutrients to the sap, which eventually returns to the parent trunk before the leaves fall and perish, the personality gathers experience and conveys it to the parent individuality, ultimately falling and perishing when its task is completed. The ego incarnates in a personality to achieve definiteness. On its own plane, the ego is magnificent yet indistinct, except in the case of individuals far advanced in evolution. The principles of man are sometimes classified as follows. The immortal triad or individuality, comprising Atma, Buddhi, and Manas, and the perishable quaternary or personality, comprising Kama, Prana, the etheric double, and the dense body. A slightly different classification distinguishes immortal as Atma, Buddhi, and higher Manas, conditionally immortal as Kama Manas, and mortal as Prana, etheric double, and dense body. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky proposed a classification of 4 divisions of the mind. Manas Dhyasi, the resplendent or illuminated Manas, corresponds to Buddhi, or the state in which Manas merges with Buddhi, possessing no independent will. Manas proper is the higher Manas, the abstract thinking mind. Antakarana is the link between higher Manas and Kama Manas during incarnation. Kama Manas represents the personality. Occasionally, she refers to Manas as the Deva ego or divine self in contrast to the personal self. Higher Manas is divine due to its possession of positive thought, which is Kriya Shakti, the power to act, as all work is ultimately executed by thought power. The term divine derives from div, meaning to shine, indicating the inherent divine quality of life radiating from within Manas. The lower mind functions merely as a reflector, without light of its own, serving as a conduit for light or sound, a mere mask. In the Vedantan tradition, particularly in Sri Shankaracharya's school, the term Antakarana designates the mind in its fullest sense, the internal organ bridging the innermost self and the outer world, described as having 4 parts. Ahamkara, the eye-maker, Buddhi, insight, intuition, or pure reason, Manas, thought, and Chit, discrimination of objects. What is commonly called the mind in the Western sense, encompassing powers of concrete and abstract thought, corresponds to Manas and Chit in this classification. The theosophist should recognize in the Vedantic divisions his own familiar Atma, buddhi, manas, and the lower mind. In the symbolism of Freemasonry, the lower mind and the mental body are represented by the senior deacon. The following table sets out the principles of man in the system of Freemasonry. Thus, the higher triad or spiritual trinity, both in God and man, are represented in Freemasonry by the three principal officers, while the lower self, personality, or quaternary, is represented by the three assistant officers and the Tyler. In Christianity, we find the following symbolism. Elements and vessels, principles in man-host, monad. Patan, atma, buddhi, manas. Wine, ego or individuality. Chalice, causal body. Water, personality. The taking on of a personality by the ego has also been likened to the projection of a spark from the flame of mind. The flame fires the material upon which it has fallen, and from that a new flame will arise, identical in its essence with that which generated it, but separated for purposes of manifestation. Hence it is said that you may light 1,000 candles from a single flame, but the flame is never diminished, although 1,000 flames are visible where only one was visible before. The thinker, the individuality, alone endures. He is the man for whom the hour never strikes, the eternal youth who, as the Bhagavad Gita expresses it, puts on and casts off bodies as a man puts on new garments and throws off the old. Each personality is a new part for the immortal actor, and he treads the stage of human life over and over again, but in the life drama each character he assumes is the child of the preceding ones, and the father of those to come, so that the life history is a continuous one. The elements of which the personality is composed are bound together by the links of memory caused by the impressions made on the three lower vehicles, and also by the self-identification of the thinker with his vehicles, which sets up the personal I-consciousness known as ahamkara, derived from aham meaning I, and kara meaning making. Ahamkara thus means the I maker. In the lower stages of evolution, this I-consciousness is in the physical and astral vehicles, the greatest activity being in these bodies. Later it passes to the lower mental body, which then assumes predominance. The personality, with its transient feelings, desires, passions, thoughts, thus forms a quasi-independent entity. Yet all the time it draws its energies from the thinker it enwraps. Moreover, as its qualifications, which belong to the lower worlds, are often in direct antagonism to the permanent interests of the individuality, the dweller in the body, conflict is set up, victory sometimes inclining to the temporary pleasure, sometimes to the permanent gain. In dealing with the personality, the obstacle to be overcome is asmita, the notion that I am this, or what a master once called self-personality. The personality, as we have seen, develops through life into quite a definite thing, with decided physical, astral, and mental form, occupation, and habits. And there is no objection to that, if it be a good specimen. But if the indwelling life can be persuaded that he is that personality, he will begin to serve its interests, instead of using it merely as a tool for his spiritual purposes. Hence, in consequence of this error, we find men seeking inordinate wealth, power, fame, etc. Self-personality is the greatest obstacle to the use of the personality by the higher self, and so to spiritual progress. The life of a personality, of course, begins when the thinker forms a new mental body, and it endures until that mental body disintegrates at the close of the period spent in devotion. The objective of the ego is to unfold his latent powers, and this he does by putting himself down into successive personalities. Men who do not understand this, and they are, of course, at the present time the great majority of humanity, look upon the personality as the real self, and consequently live for it alone, regulating their lives for what appears to be its temporary advantage. The man, however, who understands, realizes that the only important thing is the life of the ego, and that its progress is the object for which the temporary personality must be used. Thus, when he has to decide between two possible courses of action, he does not, as most men do, consider which will bring him the greater pleasure or profit as a personality, but which will bring greater progress to him as an ego. Experience soon teaches him that nothing which is not good for all can ever be good for him, or for anyone. Thus he learns to forget himself altogether, and to consider only what is best for humanity as a whole. Intensification of the personality, at the expense of the ego, is an error against which the student should ever be on his guard. Consider, for example, the probable result of the very commonest of failings, selfishness. This is primarily a mental attitude or condition, so that its result must be looked for in the mental realm. As it is an intensification of the personality, at the expense of the individuality, one of its results will undoubtedly be the accentuation of the lower personality, so that the selfishness tends to reproduce itself in aggravated form, and to grow steadily stronger. This, of course, is part of the general workings of karmic law, and emphasizes how fatal a bar to progress is persistence in the fault of selfishness. For nature's severest penalty is always deprivation of the opportunity for progress, just as her highest reward is the offering of such opportunity. When a man rises to a level somewhat higher than that of the ordinary man, and his principal activity becomes mental, there is danger lest he should identify himself with the mind. He should therefore strive to identify himself with the ego, and make the ego the strongest point of his consciousness, thus merging the personality in the individuality. The student should strive to realize that the mind is not the knower, but the instrument that the knower uses to obtain knowledge. To identify the mind with the knower is similar to identifying the chisel with the sculptor who wields it. The mind limits the knower, who, as self-consciousness develops, finds himself hampered by it on every side. As a man may put on thick gloves and find that he thereby loses a great deal in delicacy of touch, so it is with the knower when he puts on the mind. The hand is within the glove, but its capacities are greatly lessened, so the knower is present within the mind, but his powers are limited in their expression. As we saw in a previous chapter, the mental body possesses the characteristic of actually shaping a portion of itself into a likeness of the object presented to it. When it is thus modified, the man is said to know the object. What he knows, however, is not the object itself, but the image produced by the object in his own mental body. This image, moreover, for reasons which we have already discussed, is not a perfect reproduction of the object, but is liable to be colored and distorted by the characteristics of the particular mind in which it is formed. These considerations bring home to us that, in our minds or mental bodies, we do not know things in themselves, but only the images of them which are produced in our consciousness. Meditation on these ideas will help the student to realize ever more and more fully that he himself, the true individuality, is not the personality which he, as the ego, has temporarily assumed for this one earth life. The existence of an evil quality in the personality implies a lack of the corresponding good quality in the ego or individuality. An ego may be imperfect, but he cannot be evil, nor, in any ordinary circumstances, can evil of any kind manifest through the causal body. The mechanical reason for this has been explained previously. Evil qualities can be expressed only in the 4 lower subdivisions of astral matter. These reflect their influence in the mental plane only on its 4 lower subdivisions, hence they cannot affect the ego at all. The only emotions that can appear in the 3 higher astral subplanes are good ones, such as love, sympathy, and devotion. These affect the ego in the causal body, since he resides on the corresponding subplanes of the mental world. The utmost result that is brought about in the causal body by long continued lives of a low type is a certain incapacity to receive the opposite good impression for a very considerable period afterwards, a kind of numbness or paralysis of the causal matter, an unconsciousness which resists impressions of the good of the opposite kind. The qualities which the ego develops thus cannot be other than good qualities. When they are well defined, they show themselves in each of his numerous personalities, and consequently those personalities can never be guilty of the vices opposite to such qualities. But where there is a gap in the ego, there is nothing inherent in the personality to check the growth of the opposite vice, and since others in the world about him already possess that vice, and since man is an imitative animal, it is quite probable that the vice will speedily manifest in him. The vice, however, as we have seen, belongs to the vehicles of the personality, not to the man inside them. In these vehicles its repetition may set up a momentum which is difficult to conquer, but if the ego bestirs himself to create in himself the opposite virtue, then the vice is cut off at its root, and can no longer exist, neither in this life nor in all the lives to come. In other words, the principle to be applied in practical life is that to rid oneself of an evil quality in such a way that it can never reappear is to fill the gap in the ego by developing the opposite virtue. Many modern schools of psychology and education now advocate this method rather than that attacking an evil quality in a more direct fashion. "Nerve us with constant affirmatives," said Emerson with great insight. The personality is a mere fragment of the ego projecting but a minute portion of himself into the mental, astral, and physical bodies. This tiny fragment of consciousness can be seen by clairvoyance moving about within man. Sometimes it is seen as the golden man the size of a thumb, who dwells in the heart. Others see it as a brilliant star of light. A man may keep this star of consciousness where he will, in any one of the 7 chakrams of the body. Which of these chakrams is most natural depends largely upon the type or ray of the man, and also, it seems, upon his race and subrace. Thus men of the 5th subrace of the 5th root race nearly always keep that consciousness in the brain, in the chakram dependent upon the pituitary body. There are, however, men of other races who keep it habitually in the heart, the throat, or the solar plexus. The star of consciousness is the representative of the ego in the lower planes, is in fact what we know as the personality. But although, as we have seen, that personality is part of the ego, its only life and power being that of the ego, it nevertheless often forgets those facts and comes to regard itself as an entirely separate entity, and works for its own ends. In the case of ordinary people who have never studied these matters, the personality is to all intents and purposes the man, the ego manifesting himself only very rarely and partially. There is always a line of communication between the personality and the ego. This is called antikarana. Most people make no effort to use this line. In its earlier stages, evolution consists in the opening up of this line of communication, so that the ego may be able increasingly to assert himself through it and finally to dominate the personality. When this is achieved, the personality has no separate thought or will, but becomes merely an expression of the ego on the lower planes. The hold that the ego has over his lower vehicles is only very partial, and the antikarana may be regarded as the arm stretched out between the little piece of the ego that is awakened and the hand that is put down. When the two are perfectly joined, this attenuated thread ceases to exist. In Sanskrit, antakarana means the inner organ or instrument, and its destruction would imply that the ego would no longer need an instrument, but would work directly on the personality. Thus, the antakarana, being the link between the higher and lower self, disappears when one will operates the two. It must, however, be understood that the ego, belonging as he does to an altogether higher plane, can never fully express himself in the lower planes. The most that can be expected is that the personality will contain nothing which is not intended by the ego, that it will express as much of him as can be expressed in the lower world. A man completely untrained has practically no communication with the ego. The initiate has full communication. Between these two extremes there are, of course, men at all stages. It must be borne in mind that the ego himself is in process of development, and we therefore have to deal with egos in very different stages of advancement. In any case, an ego is in many ways something enormously bigger than a personality can ever be. Although the ego himself is but a fragment of the monad, he is yet complete as an ego in his causal body even when his powers are undeveloped, whereas in the personality there is but a touch of the life of the ego. It is obviously of great importance that the earnest student should do all in his power to make and keep active the connection between his personality and his ego. In order to do this, he must pay attention to life, for the paying attention is the descent of the ego in order to look through his vehicles. Many men have fine mental bodies and good brains, but they make little use of them because they do not pay attention to life. Thus the ego puts but little of himself down into the lower planes, and so the vehicles are left to run riot at their own will. The cure for this, very briefly, is as follows. The ego should be given the conditions he desires. If this is done, he will promptly put himself down more fully and avail himself of the conditions offered. Thus, if he desires to develop affection, the personality must provide the opportunity for developing affection to the fullest extent on the lower planes. If he desires wisdom, then the personality must by study endeavor to make itself wise on the physical plane. Pains should be taken to find out what the ego desires. Then, if the necessary conditions are provided, he will appreciate the effort and be delighted to respond. The personality will have no cause to complain of the response which the ego will make. In other words, if the personality pays attention to the ego will pay attention to the personality. The ego puts down a personality much as a fisherman makes a cast. He does not expect that every cast will be successful, and he is not deeply troubled if one proves a failure. To look after a personality is only one of his activities, so he may very well console himself with successes in other lines of activity. In any case, failure represents the loss of a day, and he can hope to do better with another day. Often the personality would like more attention from the ego, and he may be sure he will receive it as soon as he deserves it, as soon as the ego finds it worthwhile. In the Christian Church, the sacrament of confirmation is intended to widen and strengthen the link between the ego and the personality. After the preliminary widening of this channel, the divine power rushes through the ego of the bishop into the higher manas of the candidate. At the signing of the cross, it pushes upwards into the Buddhic principle, and from there into the Atma or spirit. The effect upon Atma is reflected in the etheric double, that upon the Buddhi is reproduced in the astral body, and what is done to the higher manas should be similarly mirrored in the lower mind. This result is not merely temporary, for the opening up of the connections made a wider channel through which a constant flow can be kept going. The general effect, as said, is to make it easier for the ego to act on and through his vehicles. The various vehicles of man, looked at from below, give the impression of being one above the other, although they are not, of course, really separated in space, and also of being joined by innumerable fine wires or lines of fire. Every action which works against evolution puts an unequal strain upon these, twisting and entangling them. When a man goes badly wrong in any way, the confusion between the higher and lower bodies is seriously impeded. He is no longer his real self, and only the lower side of his character is able to manifest itself fully. The Christian Church provides a method of assisting man more rapidly to regain uniformity. For one of the powers specially conferred upon a priest at ordination is that of straightening out this triangle in higher matter. This is the truth behind absolution, the cooperation of the man having been first obtained by confession. A break in the connection between the ego and his vehicles results in insanity. If we imagine each physical particle in the brain is to be joined to its corresponding astral particle by a small tube, each astral particle being similarly joined to its corresponding mental particle, and each mental particle to its corresponding causal particle, then so long as all these tubes are in perfect alignment, there will be a clear communication between the ego and his brain. But if any of the sets of tubes be bent, closed, or knocked partially aside, it is obvious that the communication might be wholly or partially interrupted. From the occult standpoint, the insane may be divided into four main classes as follows. Those who are insane from a defect in the physical brain. The brain may be too small, injured by some accident, pressed upon by a growth, or have its tissues softened. Those whose defect is in the etheric brain, so that the etheric particles do not correspond with the denser physical particles. Those in whom the astral body is defective, the tubes being out of alignment with either the etheric or mental particles. Those in whom the mental body is out of order. Classes 1 and 2 are quite sane when out of the body in sleep, and of course after death. Class 3 do not recover sanity until the heaven world is reached. Class 4 do not become sane until the causal body is reached, so that for this class the incarnation is a failure. More than 90% of the insane belong to classes 1 and 2. Obsession is caused by the ousting of the ego by some other entity. Only an ego who had a weak hold on his vehicles would permit obsession. Although the hold of the ego upon his vehicles is less strong in childhood, yet adults are more likely to be obsessed than children, because the adult is far more likely to have in him qualities which attract undesirable entities and make obsession easy. Briefly, the best way to prevent obsession is by the use of the will. If the lawful possessor of the body will confidently assert himself and use his willpower, no obsession can take place. When obsession occurs, it is almost always because the victim has in the first place voluntarily yielded himself to the invading influence, and his first step, therefore, is to reverse the act of submission and determine strongly to resume control over his own property. The relationship between the personality and the ego is so important that we may perhaps be pardoned for a little repetition or recapitulation. A study of the inner vehicles of man should at least help us to understand that it is the higher presentation which is the real man, not the aggregation of physical matter in the midst of it, to which men are apt to attach such undue importance. The divine Trinity within we may not yet see, but we can at least attain some idea of the causal body, which is perhaps the nearest to a conception of the true man as sight at the higher mental level can give us. Looking at the man from the lower mental level, we can see only so much of him as can be expressed in his mental body. On the astral level we find that an additional veil has descended, whilst on the physical plane there is yet another barrier, so that the true man is more effectively hidden than ever. Such knowledge should lead us to form a somewhat higher opinion of our fellows. since we realize that they are so much more than they seem to the physical eye. In the background, there is always the higher possibility, and often an appeal to the better nature will arouse it from latency and bring it down into manifestation where we can see it. Having thus studied man as he is, it becomes easier for us to pierce through the dense physical veil and image the reality which is behind. That which is behind all men is the divine nature, hence, grasping this principle, we should be able so to modify and readjust our attitude that we are able to help other men better than we could do without this knowledge. We have already seen, in the chapter on contemplation, that the consciousness of the ego may be reached by maintaining the mind in an attitude of attention, without the attention being directed to anything, the lower mind being stilled in order that consciousness of the higher mind may be experienced. By this means, ideas from the ego flash down into the lower mind with dazzling light, these being the inspirations of genius. Behold, in every manifestation of genius, when combined with virtue, the undeniable presence of the celestial exile, the divine ego whose jailer thou art, O man of matter. Genius is thus the momentary grasping of the brain by the larger consciousness of the ego, who is the real man. It is the putting down of the larger consciousness into an organism capable of vibrating in answer to its thrills. Flashes of genius are the voice of the living spirit in man. They are the voice of the inner God, speaking in the body of man. The phenomena included in the term conscience appear to be of two distinct kinds. Conscience is sometimes used to describe the voice of the ego, and at other times it is spoken of as the will in the domain of morality. Where it is the voice of the ego, it should be recognized that it is not always infallible, but may often decide wrongly. For the ego cannot speak with certainty on problems with which it is unfamiliar, being dependent upon experience before he can judge correctly. That form of conscience, however, which comes from the will does not tell us what to do, but rather commands us to follow that which we already know to be best, usually when the mind is trying to invent some excuse to do otherwise. It speaks with the authority of the spiritual will, determining our path in life. But the will, which is undoubtedly a quality of the ego, must not be confused with the desires of the personality in the lower vehicles. Desire is the outgoing energy of the thinker, determined in direction by the attraction of external objects. Will is the outgoing energy of the thinker, determined in direction by conclusions drawn by reason from past experiences, or by the direct intuition of the thinker himself. In other words, desire is guided from without, will from within. In the early stages of evolution, desire has complete sovereignty, and hurries a man hither and thither. The man is ruled by his astral body. In the middle stages of evolution, there is continual conflict between desire and will. The man struggles with kama manas. In the later stages of evolution, desire dies, and will rules unopposed. The ego is in command. Summarizing, we may say that the voice of the ego or higher self speaking from Atma is true conscience, from Buddhi is intuitive knowledge between right and wrong, from higher manas is inspiration. When inspiration becomes continuous enough to be normal, it is genius. As was briefly mentioned in Chapter 6, genius, which is of the ego, sees instead of arguing. True intuition is one of its faculties, as reason is the method of the lower mind. Intuition is simply insight. It may be described as the exercise of the eyes of the intelligence, the unerring recognition of a truth presented on the mental plane. It sees with certainty, but no reasoned proof of its certitude can be had, because it is beyond and above reason. But before the voice of the ego, speaking through intuition, can be recognized with certainty, careful and prolonged self-training are necessary. It would appear, however, that the word intuition is used with significations that vary somewhat. Thus, it has also been said that the attainment of reliable intuition in daily life means the opening of a direct channel between the Buddhic and the astral bodies. Incidentally, it may be mentioned that it works rather through the heart center or chakram than through the mind. The consecration of a bishop has special reference to this center and to the stimulation of the intuition. We thus distinguish two distinct modes for the transmission of intuition from the higher to the lower consciousness. The one comes from the higher to the lower mental plane, the other direct from the buddhi to the astral body. The intuition of the causal body has been described as the intuition which recognizes the outer. That which comes from buddhi is intuition which recognizes the inner. With buddhic intuition, one sees things from inside. With intellectual intuition, one recognizes something outside oneself. Which of these lines is the easier depends upon the method of individualization. Those who individualize through deep understanding will receive their intuition as a conviction, requiring no reasoning to establish its truth at present, though it must have been understood in previous lives or out of the body in the lower mental plane. Those who attained individualization through a rush of devotion will receive their intuition from the Buddhic plane to the astral body. In both cases, of course, the condition of receptivity to intuition is a steadiness of the lower vehicles. We need not shrink from the fact that there is frequently a psychological instability associated with genius, as expressed in the saying that madness is akin to genius, and in the statement of Lombroso and others that many of the saints were neuropaths. Very often the saint and the visionary may have overstrained their brains, so that the physical mechanism is distorted and rendered unstable. Furthermore, it is sometimes true that the instability is the condition of the inspiration. As Professor William James has said, if there were such a thing as inspiration from a higher realm, it might well be that the neurotic temperament would furnish the chief condition of the requisite receptivity. Genius may thus have an unstable brain because the higher consciousness is pressing upon it in order to improve the mechanism, so the brain is kept in a state of tension, and under such circumstances it may easily go too far until the structure breaks down under the strain. But the abnormality is on the right, not on the wrong side, being on the very front of the crest of human evolution. It is the instability of growth, not of disease. An attempt to stimulate the heart center is also made in the Christian Church at the time of the reading of the Gospel, the sign of the cross being made by the thumb over the heart center, as well as over those between the eyebrows and the throat. This use of the thumb corresponds to a pugnal pass in mesmerism, and seems to be employed when a small but powerful stream of force is required, as for the opening of centers. The heart is the center in the body for the higher triad, Atma Buddha Manas. The head is the seat of the psycho-intellectual man, its various functions being in 7 cavities, including the pituitary body and the pineal gland. A man who can take his consciousness from the brain to the heart should be able to unite Kama Manas to higher Manas, through lower Manas, which, when pure, is the Antakarana. He will then be in a position to catch some of the promptings of the higher triad. In the Indian methods of yoga, steps are taken to prevent the dangers of hysteria in those who are coming into touch with the higher planes, insistence being made upon discipline and purification of the body, and control and training of the mind. The ego frequently puts ideas into the lower consciousness in the form of symbols. Each ego has his own system of symbols, though some forms seem general in dreams. Thus, for example, it is said that to dream of water signifies trouble of some sort. Now, while there may be no real connection between water and troubles, yet if the ego knew that the personality held that particular belief with regard to water, he might very likely choose such a form of symbolism in order to warn the personality of some impending misfortune. In some cases, the ego may manifest himself in a curious external way. Thus, for example, Dr. Annie Besant has said that while she is speaking one sentence of a lecture, she habitually sees the next sentence actually materialize in the air before her in 3 different forms, from which she consciously selects that one which she thinks best. This must be the work of the ego, though it is a little difficult to understand why he takes this particular method of communication instead of impressing his ideas direct on the physical brain. The relationship between the personality and the ego is graphically described in the voice of the silence. Have perseverance as one who doth for evermore endure. Thy shadows live and vanish, that which in thee shall live forever. That which in thee knows, for it is knowledge, is not of fleeting life. It is the man that was and will be, for whom the hour shall never strike. A vivid description of the ego is given also by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky in The Key to Theosophy. Try to imagine a spirit, a celestial being, whether we call it by one name or another, divine in its essential nature, yet not pure enough to be one with the all, and having, in order to achieve this, so to purify its nature as finally to gain that goal. It can do so only by passing, individually and personally, spiritually and physically, through every experience and feeling that exists in the manifold or differentiated universe. It has, therefore, after having gained such experience in the lower kingdoms, and having ascended higher and still higher with every rung of the ladder of being, to pass through every experience on the human planes. In its very essence it is thought, and is, therefore, called in its plurality Manasaputra, the sons of mind. This individualized thought is what we theosophists call the real human ego, the thinking entity imprisoned in a case of flesh and bones. This is surely a spiritual entity, not matter, and such entities are the incarnating egos that inform the bundle of animal matter called mankind, and whose names are manasa or minds. The ray of lower manas is ever seeking to return to its source and parent, the higher manas. But while the duality persists until the consciousness has been raised to the causal level, thereby unifying the higher and lower selves, as the phrase goes, there is a continual yearning, which is felt by the noblest and purest natures as one of the most salient facts of the inner life. It is this yearning which clothes itself as prayer, as inspiration, as seeking after God, as the longing for union with the divine. My soul is athirst for God, for the living. God, cries the eager Christian. The occultist recognizes in this cry the inextinguishable impulse of the lower self to the higher self, from which it is separated, but the attraction of which it vividly feels. Whether a man prays to the Buddha, to Vishnu, to Christ, to the Virgin, to the Father matters little. These are questions of dialect, not of fact. In every prayer the higher manas, united to Buddhi and to Atma, is the real objective, veiled under whatever name time or race may give. It is the ideal humanity, the personal God, the God-man found in all religions. It is the God incarnate, the Word made flesh, the Christ who must be born in each, with whom the believer must be made one. Expressed rather more technically, the individualized God in each man, his Father in heaven, is the monad, and as the ego is to the monad, so is the personality to the ego. A warning hint, however, may here not be out of place. In the past, such expressions as looking up to the higher self, and listening to the promptings of the higher self, have been used, and it has even been suggested that the higher self ought to take more interest in the unfortunate personality struggling on its behalf on the lower planes. Gradually the student should come to realize that the personality that we see on the lower planes is but a very small part of the real man, and that the higher self is the man. For there is only one consciousness, the lower being an imperfect representation of the higher, and in no way separate from it. Thus, instead of thinking of raising ourselves till we can unite with the glorified higher self, we should realize rather that the higher is the true self, and that to unite the higher to the lower really means to open out the lower so that the higher may work more freely and fully in and through it. A man should thus endeavor to become certain, beyond the possibility of doubt, that he is the spirit or higher self. He should develop confidence in his own powers as the ego, and courage to use those powers freely. Instead of looking upon his usual state of consciousness as natural and normal, and looking upwards towards the ego as a lofty being to be reached by continuous and tremendous effort, he should learn to look upon his ordinary state of consciousness as abnormal and unnatural, and upon the life of the spirit as his own true life, from which by continuous effort he keeps himself estranged. Expressed in terms of form, when the lower vehicles are fully in harmony with the ego, they form themselves in the likeness of the ogoids. They then change very little from life to life. Similarly, when the ego is becoming a perfect reflection of the monad, he also changes but little, though he continues to grow. Those who would deliberately undertake the task of bringing the higher consciousness into the brain may do so by a careful training of the lower mind and of the moral character, by steady and well-directed effort. The habit of quiet, sustained, sequential thought, directed to non-worldly subjects of meditation, of study, also develops the mental body and renders it a better instrument. The effort to cultivate abstract thinking is also useful, thus raising the lower mind towards the higher, as well as drawing into the mental body the subtlest materials of the lower mental levels. This diagram is an attempt to give some idea of the relationship between the ego and his lower vehicles. Of the powers, faculties, and knowledge of the ego on his own plane, only a small fraction can be transmitted to the mental body. From this again, still less penetrates to the astral body, and of this but a fragment reaches the consciousness in the physical body. One of the aims of the man should be, as we have seen, so to widen and strengthen the link between the ego and the lower bodies that more and more of the powers of the ego can find expression in the lower vehicles of the personality. Above and beyond the ego resides the monad, whose relationship to the ego is somewhat similar to that which exists between the ego and the personality. Chapter 32. Initiation Stages and Symbolic Representations. We now continue the account of the ego and his vehicles at the point when the period of life on the higher mental plane has ended and the time comes for a new incarnation. It should be recalled that when the ego withdraws into the causal body, he carries with him his physical and astral permanent atoms, as well as his mental unit or molecule. These particles of matter, one from each of the three lower planes, remain with the ego throughout all his human incarnations. While withdrawn into the causal body, they remain in a quiescent or latent state. At the time for reincarnation, the ego directs his attention outward, and a thrill of life from him awakens the mental unit, causing the life web to unfold. This life web, composed of Buddhic matter, appears as shimmering gold of inconceivable fineness and delicate beauty, formed from a single thread that is a continuation of the Sutratma. Further details of this process cannot be explored here and will be addressed in a later volume. The mental unit now becomes active, as the ego seeks expression once again on the lower mental plane, to the extent permitted by the plasticity of its matter. The mental unit acts as a magnet, attracting mental matter and mental elemental essence with vibratory powers corresponding to its own, and thus suited to manifest its latent mental qualities. The process is in a sense automatic, although devas of the second elemental kingdom assist by bringing suitable materials within reach of the mental unit. The matter is initially shaped into a loose cloud around the mental unit. It is not yet a mental body, but merely the materials from which the new mental body will be constructed. The qualities themselves are not yet active. They exist only as potential, securing for themselves a field of manifestation by providing suitable matter for expression in the mental vehicle of the child. These germinal qualities, brought over from the past, are known to the Buddhists as the skandhas, and consist of material qualities, sensations, abstract ideas, mental tendencies, and mental powers. As previously explained, the pure essence of these qualities accompanied the ego into devashan, while all that was coarse, base, or evil remained in the suspended state mentioned earlier. As the ego moves outward toward terrestrial life, these qualities are integrated into the new physical man, the vehicle for the true man. Past experiences do not survive as mental images in the new mental body, for the images perished with the old mental body. Only their essence, their effects on the faculties, remain. The same principle applies when the ego focuses on the astral permanent atom and impresses it with his will. Consequently, the mental unit and astral permanent atom attract the necessary material to produce a mental and an astral body of precisely the same type the man had at the conclusion of his previous mental and astral lives. In other words, the man resumes his existence in the mental and astral worlds exactly where he left off. A man's mental and astral bodies, taken on for his new life period, being thus the direct result of his past, form a most important part of his ripe or prarabdha karma. The mental matter is at first evenly distributed throughout the ovoid. Only as the little physical form comes into existence are the mental and astral matter attracted to it. They then begin to mold themselves to its shape, and thereafter steadily grow along it. At the same time, with this change in arrangement, the mental and astral matter is called into activity, and emotion and thought appear. It should be noted that the coarser the kinds of mental matter built into the mental body, the more intimate becomes the association between the mental and astral matter, thus strengthening the element of kama manas. A young child thus cannot be said to have a definite mental or a definite astral body, but he has around and within him the matter out of which these bodies are to be constructed. He possesses tendencies of all sorts, some good, some evil. Whether these germs will develop once more in the new life into the same tendencies as in the last life will depend very largely upon the encouragement or otherwise given to them by the surroundings of the child during his early years. Any of them, good or bad, may be readily stimulated into activity, or, on the other hand, may be starved out for lack of that encouragement. If stimulated, it becomes a more powerful factor in the man's life this time than it was in his previous existence. If starved out, it remains merely as an unfructified germ, which presently atrophies and dies out, and does not make its appearance in the succeeding incarnation at all. During his early years, the ego has but little hold over his vehicles, and he therefore looks to his parents to help him to obtain a firmer grasp, and to provide him with suitable conditions. Hence the enormous responsibility resting upon parents. It is impossible to exaggerate the plasticity of the child's unformed vehicles. Plastic and readily impressible as is the physical body of a young child, his astral and mental vehicles are far more so. They thrill in response to every vibration which they encounter, and are eagerly receptive with regard to all influences, whether good or evil, which emanate from those around them. As in the case of the physical body, whilst the mental and astral bodies are in early youth susceptible and easily molded, They soon set and stiffen and acquire definite habits which, once firmly established, can be altered only with great difficulty. To a far larger extent than is ever realized by even the fondest parents, the child's future is under their control. If we can imagine our friends with all their good qualities enormously intensified, and all the less desirable features weeded out of their characters, then we can picture to ourselves the results which parents can produce in their children if they will do their full duty by them. The extraordinary sensitiveness to the influence of his surroundings commences as soon as the ego descends upon the embryo. Long before birth takes place, it continues, in most cases, up to about the period of maturity. The mental body, or rather the material out of which the mental body will be built, becomes involved with the lower vehicles during the prenatal life. The connection becomes more and more close until, at about the end of the 7th year, the lower vehicles are as closely in touch with the ego as the stage of evolution permits. The ego then, if sufficiently advanced, begins slightly to control his vehicles, what we call conscience being his monitory voice. During the prenatal period, the ego broods over the human mother in whom his future body is building, but the ego can affect the embryo but little, save through a feeble influence from the physical permanent atom. The embryo cannot respond to, and therefore does not share, the thoughts and emotions of the ego expressed in his causal body. The Hindus had various ceremonies by which they surrounded with pure influences both mother and child before and after birth. The object was to create special conditions which warded off the lower influences and brought in the higher influences. Such ceremonies were very valuable. The seeds of evil which are brought by a child in his permanent atoms have often been called original sin, though they are wrongly connected with the fabled action of Adam and Eve. In the Christian Church, the sacrament of baptism is intended specifically to help in reducing to a minimum the effects of the seeds of evil. To this end, magnetized or holy water is employed. By its means, the priest is able to set strongly in vibration the etheric matter of the child's body, to stimulate the pituitary body, and through it affect the astral body, and through that in turn the mental body. The force which is poured and rushes down and up again until, like water, it finds its own level. The exorcism performed by the priest is intended to bind down the germs of evil in their present condition, and to prevent them being fed or encouraged in any way, so that eventually they atrophy and fall out. In addition, in the ceremony as performed in the liberal Catholic Church at least, the priest making the sign of the cross down the whole length of the front and back of the child's body, builds a thought form or artificial elemental, which is filled by the divine force, and which is also ensouled by a higher kind of nature spirit known as a sylph. The thought form is a kind of cuirass of white light before and behind the child. Incidentally, through association with the thought form which is permeated by the life and thought of the Christ himself, the sylph eventually individualizes and becomes a seraph. Even if the child dies almost immediately, the baptism may be of value to it on the other side of death. For it would be quite possible for the germs of evil to be stimulated into activity in the astral world, and the thought form may be of assistance in preventing such action. Thus, in baptism, not only are certain centers or chakrams in the child aroused and open to spiritual influence, but also the germs of evil are to some extent repressed, and the child is endowed with what is practically a guardian angel, a new and powerful influence for good. It may be added that the cross which is made on the forehead of the child with the consecrated oil is visible in the etheric double all through the life of the person. It is the sign of the Christian, precisely as the thilaka spot or caste mark in the case of the Hindu is the sign of Shiva or the trident of Vishnu. The aura of a child is often a most beautiful object, pure and bright in color, free from the clouds of sensuality, avarice, ill will and selfishness which so frequently darken all the life of the adult. It is pathetic to perceive the change which almost invariably comes over the child aura as the years pass on, to note how persistently evil tendencies are fostered and strengthened by his environment, and how entirely good ones are neglected. With such abject lessons before one ceases to wonder at the extraordinary slowness of human evolution, and the almost imperceptible progress which most egos make for life after life spent in the lower world. The remedy lies with parents and teachers, the effect of whose personal character, behavior, and habits on the development of children is almost incalculable. It should be unnecessary at this stage of our study, again, to emphasize the great importance of the thoughts and emotions of parents and teachers on their charges. This subject is dealt with at length by Bishop Leadbeater in The Hidden Side of Things. In the Atlantean civilization, the importance of the office of the teacher was so fully recognized that none was permitted to hold it but a trained clairvoyant, who could see all the latent qualities and capabilities of his charges, and could therefore work intelligently with each, so as to develop the good and amend the evil. In the distant future of the sixth root race, this principle will be applied even more completely. With whatever care parents may surround a child, it is practically inevitable that the child will someday encounter evil influences in the world, which will tend to stimulate evil tendencies in himself. But it makes a vast difference whether the good or the evil tendencies are stimulated first. In most cases, the evil is awakened into activity before the ego has any hold upon the vehicles, so that when he does grasp them, he finds that he has to combat a strong predisposition to various evils. When the germs of good are tardily aroused, they have to struggle to assert themselves against evil tendencies already firmly established. On the other hand, if the parents, by exceeding care before birth, and for several years after it, have been able to excite only good tendencies, then, as the ego gains control, he finds it easy to express himself along those lines, a habit having been established. If then an evil excitation comes, it finds a strong momentum in the direction of good, which it strives in vain to overcome. The ego, unless he is unusually advanced, has but little command over his vehicles at first, but it must be borne in mind that his will is always for good, because he desires to evolve himself by means of his vehicles, and such power as he is able to throw into the balance will always therefore be on the right side. During the embryonic and infantile life, the ego is carrying on his own wider, richer life, and, as said, gradually comes more and more closely into touch with the embryo. We may note here that the relation of the monad to the universe, in which his consciousness is evolving, is analogous to that of the ego in relation to his new physical body. Since the mental body is a new one, it naturally cannot contain the memory of previous births, in which it had no part. Such memory clearly belongs to the ego in the causal body, who, together with his permanent atoms, alone persists from one incarnation to another. Hence, a man functioning in the physical world cannot remember his past lives, so long as he remembers only by means of his mental body. In the development of the human body, the gestation period corresponds to the downward course of the elemental kingdoms. From birth to the age of 7, it is considered by many educationists that the child's physical nature should receive most attention. Up to the age of about 14, the development of emotions should have chief consideration. Up to the age of about 21, the teacher should appeal especially to the unfolding of the mind. These last 3 ages may be taken to correspond to a certain extent to the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. In the first, consciousness is on the physical plane; in the second, on the emotional plane; in the third, the lower mind gradually gains ground and leads on to the stage when man becomes the true thinker. The long period of middle life is the real human career. The epoch of old age should bring wisdom. This is as yet imperfect in most people, being but an adumbration of the superhuman heights of future attainment. It is necessary to mention here a curious eventuality which, in certain rare cases, may occur when a man is reborn. In Chapter 6 we saw how, if a man leads a thoroughly degraded life, identifying himself entirely with the lower animal nature and neglecting the higher, the lower nature is severed wholly from the higher, and the incarnation is a total loss to the ego. Under such conditions, the ego has become so disgusted with his vehicles that, when death relieves him of the physical body, he casts the others aside also. In fact, he may even during physical life leave the desecrated temple. After death, such an ego, having no astral or mental body, will reincarnate quickly. This being so, the old mental and astral vehicles may not yet have disintegrated, but may, by natural affinity, be drawn to the new mental and astral bodies. They then become the most terrible form of what is known as the dweller on the threshold. Chapter 33. Summary of mental plane significance in evolution. The control, training, and development of the mental body constitute a crucial aspect of the work of one aspiring to become a pupil or chela of a master and, subsequently, an initiate of the Great White Brotherhood. The following outlines the 4 well-known qualifications for the path leading to initiation, each containing a significant mental component. Extensive volumes have been written on these qualifications, but only a brief description can be given here. They are not required in perfection, yet a partial attainment is necessary before initiation can occur. Viveka entails the aspirant learning that the inner life, the life devoted to the ego, is the true life. As Charles Webster Leadbeater observes, few things truly matter, and most do not matter at all. This principle does not imply neglect of worldly duties and responsibilities. On the contrary, the occultist must perform them with even greater diligence and care than others. What matters is the spirit in which these duties are performed, recognizing what is truly significant and what is not. This opening of the mind or conversion is precisely what is referred to in the scripture. Set your affection on things above and not on the things of the earth, for the visible are temporal, but the invisible are eternal. Discrimination is greatly enhanced by the rapidly changing circumstances into which the disciple is often placed, emphasizing the instability of external conditions. The life of a disciple is typically one of storm and stress, designed to accelerate the development of qualities and faculties to perfection. Vairagya arises from an awareness of the fleeting and unsatisfactory nature of external things, producing natural indifference to them. The aspirant increasingly focuses on the unchanging reality that is ever present. Shama requires mastery over thought, previously emphasized in this volume. The pupil must bring order to the chaos of emotions and thoughts, eliminate minor distractions, and control wandering mental activity. While still living in the world, the challenge is greatly intensified by the continual pressure of disruptive waves of emotion and thought, leaving little opportunity to consolidate forces for a meaningful effort. Steady, daily practice in concentration and meditation is often suitable. The aspirant must exercise great energy and perseverance to bring the rebellious mind under discipline, recognizing that the rapid growth of thought power can pose a danger to both self and others unless thoroughly controlled. It is better to give a child dynamite to play with than to place the creative powers of thought in the hands of the selfish and ambitious. Dhamma. To inner control must be added the control of outer actions. As the mind obeys the soul, so must the lower nature obey the mind. Carelessness in the lower part of human activity must be eliminated. Uparetai. The sublime and far-reaching virtue of tolerance means the quiet acceptance of each man, each form of existence, as it is, without demand that it should be something different, shaped more to one's own liking. Respect for the individuality of others is one of the marks of the disciple. Titiksha. Endurance means an attitude of mind that cheerfully bears all and resents nothing, going straight onwards unswervingly to the goal. The aspirant knows that nothing can come to him but by the law, and the law is good. He must realize that as he is paying in a few short lives the karmic obligations accumulated during the past, the payments be correspondingly heavy. Shraddha. The very struggles, in which the aspirant is plunged, develop in him faith in his master, and in himself a serene, strong confidence that is unshakable. Samadhana. Balance or equilibrium grows to some extent without conscious effort during the striving after the previous 5 qualifications. The soul gradually disentangles itself from ties that knit it to the world of sense, the objects in which turn away from abstemious dweller in the body, and soon lose all power to disturb his balance. Balance amid mental troubles of every kind is also necessary, this balance being further taught by the swift changes, mentioned above, through which his life is guided by the ever-watchful care of his master. Momoksha. The deep, intense longing for liberation, that yearning of the soul towards union with the divine, follows on the attainment of the other qualifications. This adds the last touch to the readiness to enter into full discipleship. Once the longing has definitely asserted itself, the soul that has felt it can never again quench its thirst at earthly fountains. The attainment of this stage makes the man ready for initiation, an adhikari, ready to enter the stream that cuts him off forever from the interests of earthly life, save as he can serve his master in them and help forward the evolution of humanity. This hunger for the things of the spirit appears to be represented in Freemasonry by the inner attitude of the candidate in humbly soliciting to be admitted to the mysteries and privileges of ancient Freemasonry. In this attitude, as every Freemason knows, the emphasis is on the urge from within the candidate himself. No man can tread the occult path on the inspiration of another. In the Buddhist system, the names given to the stage are somewhat different, though the qualifications themselves are the same in effect. The following is the Pali nomenclature. Manodvara Vijnana, the opening of the doors of the mind, or perhaps escaping by the doors of the mind. A conviction of the impermanence and worthlessness of mere earthly aims. Parakama, preparation for action. Doing right for right's sake, with complete indifference to the enjoyment of the fruit of action. Upacharo, attention or conduct. Samo, quietude of thought that comes from control of mind. Demo, subjugation, mastery over words and actions. Uparetai, cessation from bigotry or belief in the necessity of ceremonies. Hence, independence of thought and tolerance. Titiksha, endurance or forbearance, including complete absence of resentment. Samadhana, intentness, one-pointedness, involving the incapability of being turned aside by temptation. Sada, faith, confidence in one's master and one's self. Anuloma, direct order of succession, signifying that it follows naturally from the other 3, intense desire for liberation. Gatrabu, the condition of fitness for initiation. the student will readily perceive that these qualifications necessarily follow from ego consciousness. For if we can look on life from the world of the ego, we see it in true perspective with discrimination, and the ego consciousness being disentangled from the lower bodies, desirelessness is inevitable. Further, since conduct will be that of the ego himself, instead of that of the bodies, shatsampati or control of conduct will necessarily follow. And, as the world of the ego is the world of unity, of love in its widest sense, ego consciousness implies love, a word which is sometimes used to designate, from a somewhat different angle, the last of the four qualities, mumuksha, or longing for liberation. When a man appears to be reasonably near the possession of the necessary qualifications, a master may take him upon probation. This means that the man will remain for a period under very close observation. During the period of probation, the pupil is not in any sense in any kind of direct communication with the master. He is little likely to hear or to see anything of him. Nor, as a general rule, are any special trials or difficulties put in his way. He is simply carefully watched in his attitude towards all the little daily troubles of life. For convenience of observation, the master makes what is called a living image of the probationary pupil, that is to say, an exact duplicate of the man's etheric, astral, and causal bodies. This image he keeps in a place where he can easily reach it, and he places it in magnetic rapport with the man himself, so that every modification of thought or feeling in the man's own vehicles is faithfully reproduced in the image. These images are examined daily by the master, who in this way obtains with a minimum of trouble a perfectly accurate record of his prospective pupil's thoughts and feelings, from which he is able to decide when he can take him into the far closer relationship of the accepted pupil, which relationship we shall describe presently. There is not generally much ceremony in this step. The master gives a few words of advice, tells the new pupil what will be expected of him, and often, in his gracious way, he may find some reason to congratulate the pupil on the work that he has already accomplished. The living image records not only defects or disturbances, it mirrors the whole condition of the pupil's consciousness. It must be remembered that the pupil must achieve not only a passive, but also an active goodness, as a prerequisite for advancement. If a pupil on probation does something unusually good, for the moment the master flashes a little more attention on him, and may even send a wave of encouragement of some sort, or he may put some work in the pupil's way and see how he does it. Generally, however, he delegates that to some of his senior pupils. Thus, the link between the pupil and his master is chiefly one of observation, and perhaps occasional use of the pupil. It is not the custom of the adepts to employ special or sensational tests. The pupil is usually left to follow the ordinary course of his life, the living image affording sufficient indication of his character and progress. The average time for probation is said to be 7 years, but it may be indefinitely lengthened, or, on the other hand, it may be very much shortened. It has been known to extend for 30 years, and it has been known to be reduced to a few weeks. On the probationary path, the man's highest consciousness works upon the higher mental plane. When a pupil is accepted, he is taken into his master's consciousness to so great an extent that whatever he sees or hears is within the knowledge of his master. Not that the master sees or hears it at the same moment, though that often happens, but that it lies within the master's memory, exactly as it lies within the memory of the pupil, so that he could recollect it at any time that he chose to do so. Whatever the pupil feels or thinks is thus within the astral and mental bodies of his master. The master in this way blends the aura of the pupil with his own, so that his forces may be constantly acting, without special attention on his part, through the pupil. It must not be thought that a mere unconscious channel is required. On the contrary, the pupil must become a keenly intelligent cooperator. If, unfortunately, it should happen that there comes into the mind of the pupil some thought which is not fit to be harbored by the master, as soon as he feels it, he at once erects a barrier and shuts off from himself that vibration. To do this, of course, diverts his attention for a moment from his other work and takes a certain amount of energy. The union between the pupil and the master, that begins with acceptance, is permanent, so that the higher vehicles of the pupil are always vibrating in common with those of his master. The whole time he is being tuned up, thus growing more and more like the master. At all times the thoughts of the pupil are largely preoccupied with thoughts of his master and his influence, so that, while he is sensitively open to him, he is to a considerable extent closed to lower influences. It is not, however, expected that a pupil shall be actively thinking of nothing else but his master, but it is expected that the form of the master shall always be in the background of his mind, always within the immediate reach, always there when needed in the vicissitudes of life. Whilst reasonable relaxation and change of thought are necessary to mental health, the pupil should, of course, be scrupulously careful to permit no thought, even for a moment, which he would be ashamed for his master to see. The process of attuning can take place only slowly. A living being is being molded, and it is essential that the slow growth from within should adapt the form to the outside influence, much as a gardener gradually directs the limbs of a tree. Although the master is working upon thousands of people simultaneously, as well as doing other and much higher work, yet the effect is as though he were watching the pupil and thinking of no one else, for the attention that he can give to one among hundreds is greater than ours when we concentrate it entirely upon one. The master often leaves to some of his older pupils the work of tuning the lower bodies, though he himself is allowing a constant flow between his vehicles and those of the pupil. It is in this way that he does most for his pupils, without their necessarily knowing anything about it. The accepted pupil thus becomes an outpost of the master's consciousness, so that whatever is done in his presence is done in the master's presence. Although the master may be unconscious of such events at the time when they happen, nevertheless they are, as said, in his memory afterwards. The experiences of the pupil are thus in the master's mind among his own knowledge, as soon as he turns his attention to the subject concerned. Even purely physical things, such as a slight shock or noise, in the consciousness of the pupil, are also in the consciousness of the master. A wise pupil, therefore, tries to avoid any kind of shock, and for that reason he is usually a gentle and quiet sort of person. A pupil is always connected with his master by a constant current of thought and influence, which expresses itself on the mental plane as a great ray or stream of dazzling light of all colors, violet and gold and blue. When, however, the pupil sends a thought of devotion to his master, the result is a sudden intensification of the colors of this bar of light, and a distinct flow of spiritual influence from the master towards the pupil. The reason for this is that the master's power is flowing outwards always and in all directions like the sunlight. The touch of the pupil's thought vivifies his connection with the master and simply gives a wider opening through which the great ocean of the master's love can find vent. So intimate is the union between the consciousness of the pupil and his master that the pupil can at any time see what his master's thought is upon any given subject, and in that way often save himself from error. This privilege must not be misused. It is a power of ultimate reference in questions of great difficulty. It is not intended that the pupil should save himself the trouble of thinking, or of deciding ordinary matters which he is quite competent to determine for himself. In a similar manner, at a higher level, the initiate may place his thought beside that of the brotherhood, and draw into himself just as much of that tremendous consciousness as he, at his level, is able to respond to. The initiate, similarly, must strive never to introduce anything discordant into that mighty consciousness, which is acting as a whole. We may repeat here what was said in Chapter 11, that the master can at any moment send a thought through the pupil, either in the form of a suggestion or a message, when the pupil is writing a letter or delivering a lecture. In earlier stages, the pupil is often unconscious of this, but he very soon learns to recognize the thought of the master. In fact, it is eminently necessary that he should learn to recognize it, because there are many other entities on the astral and mental planes who may make similar suggestions, and it is well that the pupil should learn to distinguish from whom they came. The use by a master of his pupil's body is entirely different from what is ordinarily understood by mediumship. The mechanism and rationale of mediumship has already been explained in the etheric double and the astral body, together with the objections to it. To the use by a master of a pupil's body there can, of course, be no objections. The influence of a master is so powerful that it may well shine through to almost any extent, and a sensitive person might be conscious of his presence even to the extent of seeing his features or hearing his voice instead of those of the pupil. It is improbable that there will be any purely physical change, though this of course frequently happens in mediumship. Neither is the relationship between master and pupil in any way one of coercion, or one in which the pupil's individuality is submerged in the flood of power from the master. On the contrary, the master's influence is not a hypnotic force from without, but an inexpressibly wonderful illumination from within, irresistible because so deeply felt as in perfect accord with the pupil's highest aspiration, and as the self-revelation of his own spiritual nature. The master being himself in fullest measure a channel of the divine life, that which flows from him awakens into activity the seed of divinity within the pupil. The process is somewhat analogous to that of electrical induction. It is because of the identity of nature in the two that the influence of the master stimulates in the highest degree all the noblest and highest qualities in the pupil. The love of the master for a disciple may be likened to the sunshine which opens the lotus bud to the morning air. It may in truth be said that one smile from the master will call forth from the pupil such an outburst of affection as would be gained only by months of scholastic meditation on the virtue of love. From the above it is clear that any disturbance in the lower bodies of the pupil will affect also those of the master. Should such disturbance occur, the master drops a veil that shuts the pupil off from himself, lest there be interference with his own work. Such an unfortunate incident does not usually last longer than 48 hours, but in extreme and very rare cases it may endure for years, or even for the remainder of that incarnation. Practically all ordinary people turn their forces inward upon themselves, and thus become a jangling mass of self-centered forces. One who would become an accepted pupil must learn to turn himself outwards, concentrating his attention and strength upon others, pouring out helpful thoughts and good wishes upon his fellow men. Thus the disciple, and even the aspirant for discipleship, is taught to hold all powers entirely for the service of the world. The sharing by the lower consciousness of the knowledge of the higher is determined mainly by the needs of the work that is being done. Whilst it is necessary that the disciple should have the full use of his vehicles on the higher planes, the conveyance of a knowledge of that work to the physical body is usually a matter of no importance. The strain upon the physical body, when the higher consciousness compels it to vibrate responsively, is very great, at the present stage of evolution, and unless external circumstances are very favorable, this strain is apt to cause nervous disturbance and hypersensitiveness, with its attendant evils. Hence most of those whose higher vehicles are developed, and whose most important work is done out of the physical body, remain apart from the busy haunts of men, thus preserving the sensitive physical body from the rough usage and clamor of ordinary life. Furthermore, as soon as a pupil shows any signs of psychic faculty, full instructions are always given to him as to the limitations which are placed on its use. Briefly, these restrictions are that such faculty shall not be used to satisfy mere curiosity, for selfish purposes, in order to display phenomena. That is to say, the same considerations which govern the actions of a man of right feeling on the physical plane are expected to apply also on the astral and mental planes. The pupil is never under any circumstances to use his additional power to promote his own worldly advantage, or in connection with gain in any way, and he is never to give what is called in spiritualistic circles a test, any indisputable physical plane proof of abnormal power. There is always a gentle radiation of the master's influence flowing through the pupil, even though the pupil be not conscious of it. At certain times the pupil may feel a greatly increased flow of force, although he may not know where it is going. With a little careful attention he can learn in which direction it is going, and a little later he can follow it more definitely with his consciousness and trace it to the actual people who are being affected by it. The pupil, however, cannot direct it, being simply a channel. Later, the master may tell the pupil to seek out a person and give him some of the force. As the pupil increases in usefulness, more and more of the work is placed in his hands, thus relieving, even only in small degree, the strain upon the master. Occasionally a pupil may even be given a definite message to deliver to a particular person. It is possible to obtain constant contact with the master in another way. Just as images of persons made by a man in devotion are filled with life by the egos of the persons concerned, so the master fills with his real presence the thought form produced by his pupil. Through that form real inspiration and sometimes instruction may be given. An example of this was that of a Hindu yogi in the Madras Presidency, who claimed to be a pupil of the Master Maurya. Having met his master physically and become his pupil, the yogi claimed that he did not lose his master after he went away, for he used frequently to appear to him and instruct him through a center within himself. There is yet a third stage of even more intimate union, when a pupil becomes the son of the master. The link is such that not only the lower mind but also the ego in the causal body of the pupil is enfolded within that of the master. The master can then no longer draw a veil to cut off the pupil so as to separate the consciousness even for a moment. An accepted pupil has the right and the duty to bless in the name of the master, and a splendid outpouring of the master's power will assuredly follow his effort to do so. The son of the master can give the very touch of the master's intimate presence. He who is a son of the master either is or soon will be a member of the great white brotherhood also, that, of course, confers the power of blessing in the name of the brotherhood. In the greater mysteries, celebrated principally at Eleusis, the initiates were named apoptai, that is, those whose eyes were opened. Their emblem was the golden fleece of Jason, the symbol of the mental body. The pupil was shown the effect in the heaven world of a certain line of life, study, and aspiration on earth. He was also taught the whole history of the evolution of the world and of man, in its deeper aspect. The pupil further received not only teachings about the conditions of the mental plane, but also instruction as to the development of the mental body as a vehicle. Freemasons will be interested to note that an ear of corn was shown to the aspirant as symbolical of the supreme mystery at Eleusis, and is probably connected with the fact that a sheaf of corn is often carved on the chair of the senior warden in a Masonic lodge. When a man is initiated, the influence to which he has tuned himself on higher planes rushes through every part of his being. Though there is little effect in the solids, liquids, and gases of the physical plane, there is a great deal of radiation from the etheric double, and from his astral and mental bodies, and this is felt both by the kingdom of nature, and by such men as are in a condition to respond. A very great expansion and development of the mental body takes place in connection with the second initiation, but it is usually some years before the effects can show themselves in the physical brain. They unquestionably put a great strain on the brain, as it cannot be instantaneously tuned to the necessary pitch. The period after the second initiation is in many ways the most dangerous anywhere on the path, the danger in nearly all cases coming through pride. When a man gets a glimpse of what his intellect will be in the future, he must guard against and kill out every trace of pride, selfishness, and prejudice. This danger point in the life on the initiate is indicated in the gospel story by the temptation in the wilderness, which followed the baptism of Christ by John. The 40 days in the wilderness symbolize the period during which the expansion of the mental body is being worked down into the physical brain, though for the ordinary candidate some 40 years might well be required for its accomplishment. The eye-making faculty, the ahamkara, which is generally described as mana, pride, since pride is the subtlest manifestation of the eye as distinct from others, is the last fetter of separateness which the arhat casts off before he takes the fifth initiation and becomes a master, and a sekha. Ahamkara was born with the soul, is the essence of individuality, and persists till all that is valuable in it is worked into the monad. It is finally dropped on the threshold of liberation. In that survival of the ancient mysteries known as Freemasonry, the entered apprentice corresponds to the stage of the probationary pupil, and is required to practice the three qualities of discrimination, desirelessness, and good conduct or self-control. Discrimination will give him mental power, desirelessness, emotional power, self-control, willpower. Discrimination enables the candidate to pass unscathed through the lower regions of the astral world, represented in the first symbolical journey. Desirelessness enables him to pass through the allurements of the higher astral world, represented in the second symbolical journey. Good conduct will enable him to master the highest part of the astral world, on the very borders of the heaven world, represented in the third symbolical journey. The grip of the first degree indicates the necessity of conquering the desire nature. The general effect of the first degree is to widen somewhat the channel of connection between the ego and the personality of the candidate. The master color of the first degree is crimson. The entered apprentice in Freemasonry corresponds to the subdeacon in the Christian Church. The pass grip between the first and the second degree indicates the necessity of conquering that peculiar entanglement of the lower mind in the meshes of desire which we know as kama-manas. In the second degree, the idea of illumination is put before the candidate, the special object being the development of the intellectual, artistic, and psychic faculties, and the control of the lower mind. The effect of the degree is a more decided widening of the link between the ego and the personality. The grip of the second degree indicates the need of full control of the lower mind. The master color of the second degree is yellow. The fellowcraft in Freemasonry corresponds to the order of deacon in the Christian Church, for just as the fellowcraft is preparing himself for the work of the Master Mason, so is the deacon preparing himself for the work of the priesthood. The pass grip between the second and the third degree indicates the necessity of gaining some mastery over the strange intermediate tract beyond the lower mind, which in a certain school of thought is denominated the subliminal consciousness. In the third degree, the work is principally on the higher mental plane. The predominant color is a blue tinge. The master mason corresponds to the priest in the church. In the first degree, the Ida, or feminine aspect of the etheric force, is stimulated, thus making it easier for the man to control passion and emotion. The Ida starts from the base of the spine on the left of a man and the right of a woman and ends in the medulla oblongata. It is crimson in color. In the second degree, the Pingla, or masculine aspect of the force, is strengthened, thus facilitating the control of mind. Pingla starts from the base of the spine on the right of a man and the left of a woman, ending in the medulla oblongata. It is yellow in color. In the third degree, the Sushumna, the central energy itself, is aroused, thus opening the way for the influence of the pure spirit from on high. It is deep blue in color. The entered apprentice, as a personality, should organize his physical life for higher use. As an ego, he should be developing active intelligence in his causal body. For this, he must use his will, the first person of the Trinity, the power of Shiva, reflected by his outward turned power, or Shakti, Devi Girija or Parvati, who gives self-control, and who blesses the physical body and makes its powers holy. The fellow craft, as a personality, is organizing his emotional life. As an ego, he is unfolding intuitional love in his Buddhic body. This he does with the power of the second person of the Trinity, the love that comes from Vishnu through Lakshmi, who fulfills desires and makes life rich and full, sanctifying material prosperity and transmuting the passions of the astral body. The Master Mason, as a personality, is arranging his mental life. As an ego, he is strengthening his spiritual will, Atma. To conquer the wavering mind, he must use the power of thought, or Kriya Shakti, the divine activity of the third person of the Trinity, Brahma, reflected by Sarasvati, the patroness of learning and practical wisdom. At the same time, the entered apprentice should also be learning to control his emotions, the fellow craft should be mastering his mind, and the master mason should be developing on higher planes. For the convenience of the student, most of the above facts, together with some further ones, are tabulated as follows. In the various degrees in Freemasonry, not only is the link between the personality and ego widened, but also a link is formed between certain principles of the candidate and the corresponding vehicles of the highest officer of all time. The changes induced are somewhat of the same nature as those that occur in the Christian Church, as will be mentioned presently. The Lord Buddha was once asked by a disciple to sum up the whole of his teaching in one verse. He replied, "Cease to do evil, learn to do well, cleanse your own heart. This is the religion of the Buddha." The student will recognize here a correspondence with the Masonic system, as well indeed as with other systems. The teaching of the first degree is that of purification. The second degree instructs him to acquire knowledge. The third degree instructs the man to rise to a higher level and to consider not merely the outward action, but also the inner condition of which all outer manifestation should be an expression. For purposes of reference and comparison, the student may like to examine the following table, which sets out the main features of the system in Christianity, as followed in the liberal Catholic Church. Conclusion. Few words are needed to conclude this study of the mental body and the lower mental plane, yet it is useful to review the ground covered and gain a perspective on its relative significance within the broader framework of modern theosophy. The student is immediately struck by the contrast between the atmosphere of the mental world and that of the astral world, not to mention the physical. Compared to the mental world, the astral world appears heavy, crude, stagnant, and unsatisfying, even at its highest levels. No matter how pure and refined the feelings it evokes, one senses still being far from the true home. The dignity of man's soul requires more than feeling, however pure and unselfish. The mental plane, even its 4 lower levels, conveys the sense of being distinctly nearer home. Here consciousness experiences greater freedom, feeling more in control of itself and less subservient to its vehicles. The mental world appears cleaner and more wholesome, allowing destiny to be shaped more in accordance with one's will than is possible in the lower worlds. Consciousness can roam more freely, less constrained by space and time. Yet mastery of even the lower mental world, the domain of concrete thought, leaves a sense of incompleteness, for beyond it lie greater worlds awaiting exploration. The world of concrete thought represents the limit while one still belongs to the lower planes. Establishing a firm foundation in this realm and reaching toward the abstractions of thought brings one to the threshold of a higher and purer world, differing not only in degree but in kind from the lower worlds. Through these abstractions, one ascends to the world of spirit, drawing nearer to the God consciousness from which one is temporarily exiled. Nevertheless, the vast importance of the lower mental world must not be underestimated, particularly at this stage in humanity's psychological evolution. The principal features emphasizing the significance of mind and the mental world to human evolution may be briefly recapitulated. In the scheme of 7 chains, each chain contains globes on the lower mental plane, while 6 of the 7 chains also contain globes on the higher mental plane. Of the 49 globes in total, 24, or nearly half, reside on the mental plane. The habitat of the ego, the enduring thinker, is on the higher mental plane. The mental plane is the meeting ground of the higher and lower selves. The ray projected by the higher or divine aspect of man into the lower worlds, serving the purposes of evolution, is a ray of lower mind emanating from the higher mind. The present battleground of life for most men is kama manas, the intermingling of mind and desire. The consciousness of the majority remains centered in feeling, in the astral body. Their immediate next step is to master feelings and control the astral body, a task achievable only from the higher plane of mind. Subsequently, consciousness must rise from the astral to the mental plane. The very word man signifies the thinker, the being endowed with mind. In occultism, man is defined as that being in the universe, wherever he may exist, in whom the highest spirit and the lowest matter are united through intelligence. The development of mind in humanity has been advanced an entire round through the influence of the Lords of the Flame. In the 5th round, the progress to be achieved in mental development must be extraordinary, and from the perspective of our presently limited minds, inconceivably elevated. These considerations constitute a formidable demonstration of the crucial importance of mind and the mental body to man at his current stage, not as a final attainment, but as a necessary foundation for the future of humanity, which, as a master has stated, is the future of a being whose growth and splendor are without limit. Nevertheless, while emphasizing this vital aspect of our work, it is essential to maintain a sense of proportion, assigning each element its proper weight. Accordingly, as Annie Besant and Charles Webster Leadbeater have written, the primary objective of the Theosophical Society is not merely the cultivation of mental faculties, but the elevation of those prepared to responsiveness to Buddhic influences, the reawakening of sensitivity on a higher level of the spiral, and the preparation of humanity for the forthcoming race. The society does not undervalue mental development. On the contrary, it readies the way for the next stage, in which intuitional love will engender harmony and brotherhood, and the developed intellect will be liberated to construct a new civilization founded upon these ideals. End of the book, The Mental Body.